Hey, everybody, we have quorum in the room. I'd like to call this meeting to order. The General Issues Committee budget meeting. Members of the public are advised that our meetings are webcast live by the City of Hamilton and temporarily archived on the city's website. Other individuals and the media may also be audibly and/or visually recording this meeting. As well, a reminder that all electronic devices are to be switched to a non-audible function during committee meetings. I'll come to you, Councillor Pauls, in the changes to the agenda. Madam Clerk, do you have any changes to the agenda?
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, yes, there are. Added as item 3.1, bless you, are the minutes from the January 30th, 2020 budget meeting. Two added items of correspondence. Correspondence from Tom Cooper, Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction, respecting item 7.2, the Living Wage Report. As well, correspondence from Councillor Bridget Doherty from the City of Kingston, Portsmouth District, also respecting item 7.2, the Living Wage Report. Added is item 6.2A, Marion Emo, the President and CEO of Hamilton Burlington SPCA, to speak to the Animal Adoption Program matter that is in the council referred items, and she is here at the invitation of council.
Councillor Pauls?
Thank you. I will be leaving at 10:30. I have to go to a family funeral, so just want to be aware of that.
Thank you. I need a mover and a seconder to approve the agenda. Moved by Councillor Ferguson, seconded by Councillor Vanderbeek. All in favor? Thank you. Item 2, declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest? Seeing none. Item 3, approval of the minutes of the previous meeting from January 30th, 2020. I have a mover and seconder to approve the minutes of the previous meeting. Moved by Councillor Pauls, seconded by Councillor Jackson. All in favor? Thank you. Item 4, communications, 4.1 through to, 4.1 and 4.2 are before you. I need a mover to approve the communications. Moved by Councillor Wilson, seconded by Councillor Vanderbeek. All in favor? Thank you. Item 6, presentations, corporate and financial non-program revenue budgets. General Manager Mike Zagaric, General Manager of Finance and Corporate Services, will provide the presentation for item 6.1.
Good morning through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, and I apologize, I'm fighting a bit of a cold, so if I need to speak up, please let me know. And my notes are on the screen too, yes. Yeah. Just before I get into the corporate financials and non-program revenues, you have, there will be 3 presentations today, the first one being the corporate financials and non-program revenues, the council referred items, and what I'll ask through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, when we get to 6.2, 6.3, if I could just make the opening remarks to those presentations from the SLT table, as each of the departments will speak to each of the referred items or business cases. And as it relates to any actions that may arise from today's GSE, just as a reminder, if there are any approvals that arise out of this morning's presentations, they ultimately go to the April 1st council date for the approval of the budget. So just in case there's concerns on approving any amendments today, does that fix in those amendments as it relates to the 2020 budget? It does not. essentially those would be reflected in the recommendations report that ultimately goes to council on April 1st. So just a bit around process. And now I'll present the corporate financials non-program revenues. Just as a reminder, corporate financials non-program revenues, these are either expenditures or revenues that don't necessarily align with the department, and for that reason, they're reflected in the corporate financials and non-program revenues. So for instance, it could be contingencies or it could be dividends, and you'll see that in the presentation. As it relates to some approved amendments and proposed amendments, I'll just remind you that on January 17th, committee approved an amendment reducing the operating impacts from previously approved capital projects, and that was an amendment to $327,000. So that's already been approved by GIC, and that reflects on our current 3.5% residential tax increase position. A further proposed amendment is at our last GIC, I believe it was Councillor Partridge, asked whether or not there's further opportunities as it relates to our Electra and Hamilton Utilities dividends. We've reviewed our forecasted dividends, and what staff are suggesting is there is an opportunity to increase our dividends to reduce our current position by approximately $697,000. So again, that's a potential proposed amendment that's before committee for your consideration. And I can speak to a bit of that in one of the later slides. So as it relates to corporate financials, there's really two categories. It's corporate initiatives as well as corporate pension benefits and contingency. You can see the changes in each one of those, and I'm going to speak to these in more detail. With respect to corporate initiatives, the change 2020 to 2019 is approximately $3.8 million. It represents an 89% change, and I'll speak to what's driving that. On corporate pension benefits and contingency, the change is approximately $600,000, and that represents about 3.9%. With respect to the corporate initiatives, area rating of land is captured into corporate initiatives, and so you can see a pressure or a change in 2020 relative to 2019 as it relates to area rating of land. So just as a reminder, when it comes to acquisition of land in some of our communities, we've acquired land, and it could be school board disposition assets or other strategic purchases. We area rate a portion of the cost of that against the former municipalities. So in 2020, what's driving this in part is the Ancaster Arts Center, the second phase of the area rating of that facilities investment, Broughton East purchase, Vincent Massey purchase. Those are the three primary investments and acquisitions that are driving the $600,000 increase. So again, those in part would have been funded by area rating, again, a portion of those costs against the former municipalities. We've mentioned operating impacts from capital on a number of occasions. Operating impacts from capital represent about $1.7 million increase, and again, these were capital projects that were either approved in 2019, previous years, that are coming on stream and require additional FTE or financial resources, and that contributes approximately $1.7 million in pressures. There's a number of other items. The brackets represent a reduction. So in other items, a reduction year over year of about 82,005%. Financial charges, you'll recall in some of my previous presentations, I spoke to IT software and the change in the model around IT software. So approximately 1.5 of it, the 1.528 million represents that pressure. So again, that's currently reflected in our budget, and we've spoken a few times on that issue. So again, that's what's driving the $3.8 million, approximately $3.8 million change. With respect to corporate pensions, benefits, and contingency, we have a number of obligations for retirees. And so for many of you, you'll know that we have some legacy pension funds. the HSR Legacy Pension Fund, and our Hamilton Wentworth Pension Fund. So as it relates to those pressures, as specific to those legacy funds, there's an inflationary increase of about 2%, and that represents approximately $224,000. With respect to our current employees, what's driving the current employees is some obligations around vacation liability, and that's primarily as it relates to fire services, as well as a contribution to reserve for sick bank, again, principally related to fire services. And that represents an increase of about $330,000. There's some other items that represent an increase of about $48,000, and again, that's a number of smaller pressures across a number of accounts. So again, that represents about a further $600,000 increase, or about 4%. With respect to non-program revenues, so again, these are revenues that don't necessarily align to one of the services in our programs or service areas. Payment in lieu of taxes, this is an issue that we've discussed previously. On the positive is it's increasing $300,000, about $115,000 of that $300,000 is actually heads and beds. So where there are increases in full-time student enrollment in our post-secondary or additional beds in our healthcare sector, that's contributing about an additional $115,000 of the $300,000. So brackets represent additional revenue. So again, brackets are revenue. Where you see a change with brackets, that's additional revenue reducing, helping us with respect to our levy pressures. So payment in lieu of taxes, it's again about a 2% increase. Just as a reminder, there's not a change in the rate for heads and beds. It remains $75. This is just where there's higher full-time student enrollment and or beds, as well as some other areas. So again, education, healthcare represents about $115,000 of the $300,000. Penalties and interest, we've discussed arrears. What we've reflected is our 5-year average as it relates to property tax arrears and the penalty and interest the city accrues from that. What we're reflecting is an additional $500,000 for a total $11 million as it relates to penalty and interest, and that represents about a 5% increase. Just as a reminder, you have, in 2019, you've approved some measures to try to reduce the number of arrears, so additional notices, and we are reporting back. So again, we're trying to reflect what our 5-year average is, but we're mindful of the fact that you're asking us to reduce the arrears, which could reduce that penalty and interest revenue line. So again, we are supportive of increasing it by $500,000 for 2020, and we'll review that in 2020 as we enter into 2021 budget deliberations. Right-of-way revenues, again, this is prescribed. In fact, it's a protected class. And so there's no change in 2020 relative to 2019 as it relates to our right-of-way revenues. Senior tax credit, again, we're not suggesting any change in the program. In fact, the program changes as it relates to the dollar value and some of the parameters. What we're reflecting is based on historical experience. We're seeing a $20,000 reduction in the overall funding. Again, we're not reflecting any changes in the eligibility, reducing the eligibility or the amount. Supplementary taxes, so this is assessment growth that's realized in year or changes as it relates to assessment, and that represents a further $300,000 revenue increase for 2020 relative to 2019. Our enterprise grants are grants that are provided to our downtowns, Hamilton downtown and the former community downtowns, as well as the BIAs. And so what we're reflecting based on our experience is a $200,000 increase to our enterprise grant funding envelope. LEADS grants are grants that we provide to those developments that meet a LEADS requirement as an incentive for those property owners to make those investments, environmental and operational investments. You'll you'll recall, I think was Maple Leaf was the previous recipient, and I think that's expiring. What we expect is Stryker will be eligible for this in 2020. So while you see a reduction in the overall funding from 700,000 to 500,000 because of the potential for Stryker in 2020, we feel comfortable with the $500,000 envelope for 2020. Veterans grants, so you'll see veterans grants is decreasing from $148,000 to $20,000, just to avoid a reaction to this. Is just as a reminder, the provincial government changed legislation, and veteran halls are now property tax exempt, so they're no longer requiring a grant. They'll actually be exempt from property taxes. The remaining remnant to that is there is one club that rents land or rents a facility, and so that's the $20,000 remnant as it relates to our veterans grant. And then there's a series of other adjustments that represent an additional approximately $62,000 in revenues. So again, all of those changes reflect additional $1.3 million that we're forecasting for 2020, or a total of about $29.5 million. Additional non-program revenues, I've mentioned the Electra and Hamilton Utilities Corporation dividend. There's three pieces to the dividend as to how it's reflected in our budget process. There's about $9 million, I believe about $9.2 million that's reflected in our capital program. The remaining remnant is $5.3 million, so about $14 million, just over $14 million for 2020. What we recommended in the opening slide is based on our 2019 and based on some preliminary information from Electra and Hamilton Utilities Corporation is budgeting this at the 2019 level. So again, the $5.3 million, it's broken up into two pieces, and I'll just have to check notes because it's broken up into contribution to capital and a contribution to our poverty reduction and housing strategy. So as it relates to the 5.3, $3 million goes to the poverty reduction and housing strategy, and $2 million goes to our capital financing plan, and the remaining $300,000 is our capital financing for 2020 for the national housing strategy. So we have a capital financing requirement for 2020, and that $300,000 will go to service that requirement. So again, the positive message today is we see opportunity to increase our preliminary forecast for the hydro dividend. Investment income, you may recall at the corporate services budget, I identified that our investment income for 2019 was about $35 million. 4.1 of that $35 million goes to reducing the levy. The balance goes into the reserves to improve the sustainability of the reserve fund balances. So again, we're not recommending any change as it relates to investment income in 2020 relative to 2019. And I will just caution in terms of some signs as to what we should expect in 2019 is there may be some headwinds as it relates to investment income in 2020. Coronavirus will have an impact, as well as there seems to be some consensus on some rate decreases, potentially 2 rate decreases in 2020. So whenever there's a bank rate decrease, that reduces our investment income. So those are some headwinds, potential headwinds into 2020 that might affect our investment income. Our Flamborough slot revenues, 2020, we're recommending based on historical performance is increasing the Flamborough slot revenue assumptions by additional $200,000 from $5 million to $5.2 million. And our POA revenues, what we're reflecting is a decrease in our POA revenues of about $60,000. This excludes earlier conversations around the automated speed enforcement and the traffic enforcement. We haven't factored that into our current assumptions around POA revenues. This is, and I wasn't intending on going through this slide, this is just for your information It's a historical performance slide of non-program revenues, and it's just there for your reference as it relates to what we've experienced and how that helps to inform our forecast for 2020. And that represents the end of the corporate financials, non-program revenues through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. Happy to answer any questions that committee might have.
Thank you, General Manager Zagarek. 2 speakers on the list. Councillor Ferguson.
Thank you, and through to Mike. Mike, a lot of numbers up there today. And if you just go to slide 7, first question. Are brackets good?
Yes. So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, this is probably the only time that you will see red as a positive and brackets
Do
as a
that to us,
positive.
you know, they-
Yes.
Brackets are sometimes good, sometimes bad.
So again, through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, please interpret brackets as a positive, and what you can see is historically, all of these particular categories have had a net positive contribution to the city.
So what's a 45.1% reduction in the net levy mean in dollars?
So including education, that would probably put us close to about 4.5%, 4.6% as a levy impact. So 1% is 9 million. So somewhere about 4.5%.
Last time you were up there, you were at 3.5.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, the 3.5 reflects all of this information with the exception of further amending the dividend assumption by just short of an additional $700,000.
This presentation will result in what on the net levy? It goes from 3.5 to?
So again, if committee approves this adjustment, we're still going to be close to 3.5. It would just represent an additional $700,000 reduction in the levy. So I'm not sure rounding whether it probably won't even bring us to 3.4. We'll probably still be in a 3.5% residential tax increase position.
Okay, there's a lot of numbers up there to not have, you got me all excited at a 45% savings, but it doesn't mean anything.
Well, through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, it does mean something because it helped us to achieve our current position of 3.5%.
Okay, can you go to slide, nope. I think it's slide 4. So the area rating, and you said the biggest impact of that was the Ancaster Arts Center, and you recall during the Ancaster Arts Center discussion, we couldn't get a commitment on the second half of the federal grant until a contract was awarded, and we couldn't award a contract under city policy until it was properly funded. So we agreed to area rate extra, and after that area rating was approved by council, we had the extra $1.2 million come in from the feds. Does that not reduce the area rating impact then?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I'll ask Brian. I'm assuming we've reflected that. So out of that $615 increase at the Ancaster Arts Center represents about $316 of the $615. So not sure if Brian has the answer today. If we don't have the answer today, we'll confirm that it's netted off of the area rating impact.
So through the chair, we'll double check those numbers. So our schedule reflects an amount for Ancaster Arts Center, of course, 2 items in there from previous year and last year. So we can confirm that.
Okay, and the whole 1.2 million then will be applied to the total of the area rated part, which is, I recall, about $2.6 million in that area. It was 8 million in total divided by 3, and a lot of numbers again.
Yeah, so through the chair, we can confirm that separately, separate email.
Okay, that's all.
Councillor Jackson.
Thanks, Deputy Mayor. Thanks, Mike. And Mike, just some quick questions for clarification. On slide 2, please. The impact of capital new traffic signals, that's a savings of $327,000. Just to be clear, that is not at all delaying or deferring any of the capital traffic light installations. Is that just reflective of some bundling or packaging and some efficiencies found in terms of how traffic is going to move ahead, installing the lights. Can just somebody offer some explanation of that, Mr. Deputy Mayor, please?
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, it isn't a impact of reduction in service level. It's some changes to the assumptions around the complement and resources to support it, and I'm not sure if Dan wants to add to that.
Thanks, Mike. Dan, please.
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, or Mr. Mayor, that's correct. When Edward reviewed the operating impacts from capital, he felt that we could get away with fewer staffed for every new signal.
Great. Thank you, General Manager. Staying on that slide. So, Mike, for those of us that were here last term and went through another merger with Horizons and then Electra, Mr. Deputy Mayor. From the original merger years ago, and an amalgamation, then as the years went along, I think we were garnering up to about $8 million, correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, per year of HUC revenue. And I supported all those mergers, mostly because of the additional revenue to Hamilton and to taxpayers to help on the levy every budget year. The last merger, the big one with, 6 other municipalities to form Electra, I thought we were going to see something like the $8 million jump to about $14 million a year. And what am I missing here? I see only about $700,000 extra dollars, Mike, that you think you can find from HUC dividends. And Mr. General Manager, where's that extra pocket in your vest, please? Through you, Deputy Mayor.
Yeah. So through you, Mr. Deputy, I feel a theme of disappointment today, that I'm disappointed.
Oh, not at all, not at all.
So the councillor's recollection is right on. So I'll take you through the changes, and for 2020, we are reflecting about 14.8 million in total dividends. So you'll see in this slide again, as it relates to the now Electra and Hamilton Utilities Corporation dividends, what we're reflecting is the impact on the operating budget. What you're not seeing is how we've applied the dividends towards our infrastructure investments. So just as a reminder, on the December capital budget, tax-supported capital budget deliberations, there's about $9 million incorporated in that financing strategy to help pay for our infrastructure. And the reason we focus dividends on infrastructure is dividends can vary from time to time, and tying the dividends to infrastructure is a better match because we can adjust infrastructure better than we can adjust operating impacts. So we've tried to keep this line relatively consistent. What was reflected in 2017, the post-merger, there was a special one-time dividend in 2017. So coming out of the merger, and they reviewed the balance sheets and what was required in order to facilitate the merger, there was a one-time top-up in the dividend that affected us in a positive way in 2017. So to the councillor's question is, yes, we've gone from $8 million gross total to now $14.8 million. $9 million is for infrastructure. That was approved in the December 2019 tax-supported capital budget. $5.3 million is what we're recommending now for the operating budget. And again, about $2 million is towards capital again out of the 5.3, and the $3 million towards, it is capital, towards housing and poverty reduction. So that was the 10-year housing and poverty reduction strategy. And so hopefully I've explained correctly that we are realizing in excess of $14 million in 2020 and the breakdown on how we're applying those proceeds.
Thank you, General Manager. Never, ever a disappointment, at least to this Ward 6 councillor, and you just bring the reality of what's in front of us, and with SLT, your best recommendations to help the tax levy be as minimal as possible with any increases. So on the 14 million, give or take, Mike, and you've just enunciated 9 million went to infrastructure, 5.3 reflected there for this levy, Mr. Deputy Mayor. So, Mike, if this council later on wishes to have a debate, and in light of budget pressures on the operating side, and in more services we may wish to provide, or conversely, not reduce and get into a situation with that ugly list that many of us have seen recently in trying to huddle as to, Mr. Deputy Mayor, how we're going to get the 3.5 decreased, hopefully further. Can we have a debate at some point in time as to globally how council would like to use the 14 million in the future, Mr. Deputy Mayor, through you?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, the ward councillor may want to withdraw his previous complimentary remarks because I'm going to disappoint you. The 14 million, with the exception of $700,000, is already committed. When you approved the 2020 tax-supported capital program, we incorporated about, again, $9.5 million in dividend financing to pay for our tax-supported capital financing strategy. So when you approved the capital program, you approved that $9.5 million.
I mean going forward, though, Mike. I'm not trying to reverse. I mean going forward, please.
So going forward is we will, in 2021, for the purpose of 2021, it's always an option with respect to the capital financing. So if those funds were directed towards operating, so some concerns is we need to have a sense what those dividend forecasts are going forward, because when you incorporate them in operating, it becomes a bit of a pressure with the peaks and troughs potentially in dividends. That's why we put it into capital. Capital gives us more flexibility to adjust for the peaks and troughs around dividends. The other challenge is if you direct the $9.4 million in 2021 towards operating, that creates a $9.4 million gap in our capital financing strategy. So that'll create a pressure on the capital program. So that's where committee does not necessarily have flexibility. You have flexibility as to how to apply the proceeds, but if you move it from capital to operating, it just represents a $9.4 million challenge as it relates to capital. With respect to the $5.3 million, again, $3 million is committed towards the 10-year poverty reduction in housing each year. So again, that I don't recall when that expires. It may be 2026 or around there. So there's still a number of years committed towards that. And the final piece of that $5.3 million is the $2 million that as well was incorporated in our capital program. To be brief, what committee has available to itself today is to amend the adjustment favorably for an additional $700,000.
So, Mike, thank you. And if I was a bit asleep at the switch then in terms of how the HUC dividends of $14 million annually, Mr. Deputy Mayor, was divided up and where it was placed and recommended, I'll take my share of responsibility. Maybe going into 2021, maybe there could be just a suggestion for a simpleton like me, General Manager, that maybe there could be a HUC type of chart where possibly options can be shown, pros and cons, X amount for capital, X amount for operating, pros and cons, upside, downside, maybe something a little more elaborate, at least for someone like me going forward, please.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, we'll incorporate that into our future 2021 deliberations.
Thank you. And last question on slide, Mike, on slide 5. So total tax adjustments, again, I'm just a little bit confused, similar to Councillor Ferguson. Is this then, back to page 2, the 697 and this 1.3? Am I adding those two together as a tax adjustment against the levy? Mr. Deputy Mayor, through you. That's my last question.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, the non-program revenues are not in slide 2 nor 3. So these are revenues, again, like payment in lieu of taxes that accrue from our institutional partners. It includes penalty and interest that accrues from tax arrears. So again, these aren't necessarily tied to a particular service area. So with respect to the $1.3 million favorable change, that is currently reflected in the 3.5%. So again, and I apologize, I should have been clear, all of these changes are reflected in our current position, again, with the exception of the hydro potential increase in the Electra and HUC dividend.
Crystal clear now. Thanks, General Manager. Thanks, Deputy Mayor.
Counselor Wilson?
Thank you, Chair. I'm really appreciative of Councillor Jackson's questions because they were at the root of mine in trying to understand the breakdown and trying to understand the policy that this council is governed by in deciding its allocation. So I'm very appreciative of that. But I just want to make sure that I'm crystal clear on the understanding, particularly with respect to the 5.3. Again, the 3 million is earmarked for our poverty reduction as it relates to housing, and the 2 million relates to, you said, other capital. Could you just clarify that 2 million for me, please, Mr. Zagarek, through you?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, the 2 million had actually contributed to our 2020 capital financing strategy. So we built in 9 million on the capital side through the budget process, as well as an additional 2 million contribution from operating. So it really represents about $11.5 million.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. And just so I understand, you said, you hinted that it's probably not advisable for us to take dividends and apply them to operating because of the fluctuation as it pertains to dividend. It means a more precarious funding source for our long-term capital infrastructure. Is that correct? Did I understand that?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I'll just use this chart to illustrate. So for instance, if in 2017, council took the top up, the $10 million and applied it to reduce the levy, coming out of that extraordinary year in 2017, because of the one-time dividend top-up, we would have gone into 2018 with about an $8 million difference, which would have been a pressure, which would have contributed to a 1% levy increase. So because of the nature of dividends, they vary from year to year, on the infrastructure side, capital side, it gives us more flexibility to sort of blend that out. Right. On the operating side, it could create a lot of variability in the levy increase, and just using those extremes as an example, you build in $10 million in dividend the following year, you realize only $2.6 million. Now there's an $8 million pressure, and that's about a 1% levy increase. And so we're trying to avoid those fluctuations.
Okay, thank you. And so when it comes down to the 700,000 that is to play with, your suggestion is that amount be applied to the operating portion.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, subject to the will of committee, if committee were to approve this adjustment, it would go towards improving our 3.5% current position.
May I ask, in the past, what has been council's direction with that leftover portion as it pertains to operating? Has there been a policy direction, or has it always been assumed that it applies to the levy?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, in the past, it's gone towards reducing the levy impact, and just given the nature of the timing of these presentations, it's gone towards reducing the levy pressure, and you'll see the next two agenda items are council referred and business cases. So I would say in part, it might provide some funding or financing as it relates to those incremental investments. But that's because of the timing of these presentations. This is information that normally we don't receive from our hydro partners because they're on a different calendar year. So a bit of a challenge. And just timing-wise, the impact is it would reduce our 3.5% and provide some opportunity for consideration of the business cases in council.
Thank you. So just so I understand, back to Councillor Ferguson's earlier question, we're not moving from, at this point, with this, from the 3.5, but it is the prerogative of this council to have a deliberation on the application or where we house that 700 to play with. Is that?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, how we normally track this is if this were to be approved, we would show it as an amendment. And so our current residential tax increase position of 3.5, it'll likely still stay at 3.5%, but the dollar amount will decrease. So you'll see a decrease, and through your deliberations as it relates to business cases and council referred, those are investments Some of them are net levy zero, but some represent additional investments. And the final piece, so again, that would increase our current position. And the final piece is pending future deliberations on mitigation strategies. Those mitigation strategies may further reduce our current position. So again, I think what the councillor is asking, can the $700,000 be applied directly towards those? You can see it indirectly through the process. The process shows that the position decreases, and then if there's an investment, further investment, that could drive up the percent. I hope I've answered the
Yes,
councillor's question.
thank you very much. And I just want to put on the public record that I'm certainly in discussing the policy framework for the dividends. I would debate very strenuously against any proposal to diminish our capital reinvestment. Since we are below that, it seems, practiced municipal threshold of 15 to 20%. We're about, what, Mr. Zagarek, 11 or 11%?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I think we're in that 11 to 12% on average over the last 5 years.
Thank you. The second question I have, if I may, is it's been a long time since I put my mind to the Ancaster Arts Centre, and I just want to make sure I have a full understanding of that area rated levy item. If you could just, Finance for Dummies, if you could just explain that, that amount and where it's spread.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, typically, as it relates to either acquisition of properties such as school board dispositions, our previous practice has been to fund it through three principal sources. Parkland dedication, from ward reserves or unallocated capital, and the final portion through area rating. And how area rating applies, it's applied to former municipality. So in the case of Ancaster Arts Centre, it was applied against the properties within the boundary of the former municipality of Ancaster. In the case of, and that would be consistent with Dundas or Flamborough or Stony Creek or Glanbrook. In the case of wards 1 through 9 now, and just because of ward realignment and portion, anything in the former municipality, for instance, if it were to be Ward 1, anything that is acquired in portion area rated in Ward 1 is applied against all properties in the former municipality of the City of Hamilton. And that's why, as it relates to investments in the former municipality of the City of Hamilton, just because of density and the size is dollar-wise, they tend to be less material than the other municipalities. So again, it's applied against all properties in the former municipality. So in the case of Ancaster, what we're reflecting of that $615 change is $316 of that $615 is tied to the Ancaster Arts Centre and paid for through Ancaster property owners.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I have no further speakers. It's always amazing that you have all of these figures and on the tip of your tongue.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I appreciate Councillor Clark highlighting that the notes were in there because all of those amazing figures are provided by the amazing staff.
I need a motion to receive the presentation. Moved by Councillor Partridge, seconded by Councillor Clark. All in favor? With enthusiasm. Carried. So we're going to be asked to approve the proposed amendments. Just a reminder that approve just means that it moves to the final budget process. So if there's no further speakers on what we're being asked to approve here, I need a mover and a seconder to approve the proposed amendments. Moved by Councillor Nan. On 6.1, yes. Moved by Councillor Nan, seconded by Councillor Collins. All in favor, electronic vote. On 6.1. Thank you. So on item 6.2, which is council-referred items, General Manager Zagarek will give an introduction of this, and then we will go through each one. And you have 3 choices for each one. We can approve, receive, or refer to a future 2020 GIC budget meeting, or refer to the 2021 budget. So those are the choices before you. So General Manager Zagarek, if you want to introduce 6.2. Yes?
Will we be going through each individually and debating each individually? Okay.
We'll go through
You might have said that.
General Manager?
Thank you, through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. I'll just start the presentation off by taking you through the summary table. And then what staff are suggesting is we can go through each of the referred items, with the exception of 2. There are 2, I believe it's the winter sidewalk clearing and the Snow Angels report. What we're recommending is those 2 items are on the February 13th GIC. So it would be best to refer those 2 items to the February 13th budget GIC.
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I'm sorry. As the matter was actually already referred, you don't need to refer it again. It was at the last one, but staff needed to show it in to get the numbers today. So the Snow Angels and the sidewalk clearing are not before you for consideration today. Those 2 were already referred to the February 13th meeting to allow delegations to speak to the matter on
That's
the
CR5
10th.
and CR6 on
Yep.
the table.
Thanks, Stephanie. And so, as Stephanie has just mentioned, is for the purposes of providing comprehensive reporting, we've captured those 2 items in the summary. So you may recall that previously the council referred items represented a 0.2% potential increase, and because of the winter clearing, winter sidewalk clearing, and I don't believe the Snow Angels has a net impact. And the final one being, I believe our previous report didn't capture the living wage, or one version didn't. Because of those items, if all of the referred items were to be approved, and there are 13 in total, and you can see on the summary slide, that would represent an additional impact, residential tax impact of about 0.5%. It would represent in 2020 approximately $5 million in additional levy investments, as well as approximately 15.5 FTEs. So again, they are before committee for your consideration, and as we've spoken to earlier this morning, again, you have options to approve, receive, or refer this to future 2020 or future year deliberations, and we're in your hands. Again, staff are here to speak to each one of the items, with the exception of the winter sidewalk clearing report.
Thank you. So I have 2 speakers on the list. Are these general questions, or are we going to move right into CR1? You're on.
Thank you. So I understand we're not going to be dealing with sidewalk clearing today, but I would like to request of staff that they look at the Ward 9, the urban area, and see what the cost would be to do snow clearing in Ward 9, strictly in the urban area, so Upper Red Hill Valley to Centennial Parkway, to the Hydro Corridor, to the escarpment, and what that cost would be area rated to Ward 9 residents. I've asked offline for that, but I'd like to make that a formal request so that it can be captured and come back during that discussion. I'd like to be able to share that information with my Ward 9 residents and see whether or not they have any inclination. We have a rather large aging population in Ward 9, and I've been getting a lot of calls about it. And so I think this might be one way of actually having some education about it and see if there's something that we can do specifically in Ward 9, regardless of what happens citywide. So do I need to make that as a formal motion, Mr. Deputy Mayor? Or I'm looking to you, to the clerk, to Mr. Zagarek?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I would just ask if the councillor can just share with us that boundary, because it, again, I just can't recall what the councillor just described as a boundary.
So it would be the Red Hill Valley Parkway to the west, to Centennial Parkway to the east, to the Hydro Corridor, which is just south of Summit Park, and to the escarpment face. So that is the only area in Ward 9 that actually has sidewalks. The rest, 85% to 90% of the ward is now rural. So that component, we'd only be looking at the urbanized component. So do we need a motion, or are we okay with that?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, we'll work with Public Works. Public Works, if they can provide us the costing, we can look at the financing scenario.
So we're good?
Take that as
Everyone's nodding? Yes, thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you. So, general discussion here before we go into each item, because we will go through each item one by one. So we're still in general discussion. Point of clarity? Is that a point of order? What's a point of clarity? Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just on that particular subject, I would like to have the same thing for Ward 13. So how do I, like, is there a motion? At what point do I have an opportunity to add my ward urban area only to it?
I think both of these items have technically been deferred to February 13th, so you have time to.
So that motion would come forward later.
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, staff would actually need to know today, because they only have a few days to prepare for the February 13th meeting, when that information would be coming back. So that's why I didn't push for a motion, only because by the time it gets approved, staff will have already reported back. So if you did want to add anything as far as sidewalk snow clearing or the snow angels, staff would only have between now and the Tuesday,
So
actually.
that's why I asked for the clarity. So is there going to be a motion today, or is it going to be direction to staff? Direction?
Council Clark provided that publicly as direction to staff.
Okay.
General Manager.
Then I can deal with staff on that. I don't need, I just was worried, I just didn't catch that, so I was worried if there was,
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, as long as staff have the information you're looking for before you leave today, so that they can work on it, you're fine. But you need to see staff today, or they won't have time.
I will absolutely discuss this with staff today. Thank you. Thank you.
And through you, Mr. Deputy Mayors, we will try to be prepared for February 13th, just as a reminder, because we have a policy on area rating for snow clearing that's urban rural. So if the intent is to be more granular as it relates to those boundaries, we'll have to review that policy as well.
Thank you. Councillor Collins, general question?
Yeah, I have a comment. Not certain it's a question. We're at 3.5% now, and I know that with assessment, some wards are closer to 5.5%, 6%. So I'm not interested in adding anything today. If there are questions about enhancements as it relates to FTE impacts, service levels, I won't be supporting any increases today until we bring the number down under 2. So I just want to put that on the table. And sorry, under 3, so into the 2s. So I just want to put that on the table in case there's a long discussion about adding them. I won't be supporting any of the initiatives. I certainly would entertain these after we've made some progress in terms of providing some additional reductions. We'll need at least 4.2 million to get us under 3, and that's a lot of service reductions. And so I think it's premature to start talking about service enhancements before we've gone as far down and made some progress in terms of some reductions going in the other direction. So those are my comments.
So just as a reminder, the general recommendation here is to approve, so if you do not wish to approve, you'll have to make those amendments, and we can go through that one by one. Counselor Partridge.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And similarly, I won't be approving or voting in favor of anything that's before us until we get our budget in line and down to, I'm looking at around 2.5, 2.7. Until we get down there, I'm not about to approve anything. But I do have a question. On CR 13, I understood that this is to do with the animal adoption pilot program, and I understood that there was a request, I believe it was from Councillor Jackson, that we invite the SPCA to come in and speak to us. And I don't recall that happening.
I do have in my,
Sorry, that was supposed to be a gentle tap. Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor.
You want to
Marion
throw
Emo
glasses
is
at each
here.
other now?
Ms. Emo is here. She was invited.
Oh,
She is
terrific.
here to speak. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very
when we
much.
get to that item.
Okay,
it's on my
thank you.
roadmap.
All right.
Counselor Jackson?
Mr. Deputy Mayor, I'm trying to follow your wishes here, but two items here. I just on a point of principle, I don't understand why they're here because they both were to have been dealt with at the grants subcommittee, and they both were matters that, well, I'll tell you what they are. Would you allow me just to quickly isolate them, or you still want to go through one by one?
You can, let's have a general discussion now, and then we can get into
Okay, thank you. And Director Hertel is here. Concession BIA CR-07, the 2730 enhancement. That was supposed to be a grant subcommittee which would allow the BIA to have a higher base as a base moving forward instead of me every year having to fight for this additional 2730 because the staff base is 2730 lower. And every year grants approved the additional 2730, council ratified it. So I don't understand why it's here right now as an enhancement unless a grants committee may be misdealing with it. Could I just get that explanation, please?
rationale.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor.
Through the chair, my understanding in terms of why it's here, Councillor, is that through grants subcommittee, it was recommended, to your exact point, that it, as opposed to it being, I'll refer to as a sort of a top-up each year, that it be referred to the budget process so that it would become a permanent part of the base for that particular organization.
Okay. All right, so then we can deal with that as we get into debate. The second one on a point of principle as well then, Mr. Deputy Mayor, CR-04, Canusa. I thought that staff internally, Mr. Deputy Mayor, had worked on the transferring of the Canusa funds from grants to the Recreation Department. I thought that was all done, and yet I still see again now a $10,920 portion. Through you, please, to Director Hertel, maybe for an explanation.
Yes, thank you, Councillor. And through the chair, you're correct, Councillor, in that at the grant subcommittee, the overall approval to move it to the Healthy and Safe Communities group was approved. And there were two components. One was the recommended amount that staff had put forward. And then there was the, I'll say, desired total amount, which, if memory serves, is somewhere in the total neighborhood of around $40,000. So the recommendation at the time was that the portion that staff were recommending through the grant subcommittee would automatically go forward because it was a direct transfer from the budget in the grant subcommittee, whereas the $10,000 or $10,920 was suggested to be an incremental amount of operating budget for the Healthy and Safe Communities to be able to have the total amount required or desired for the particular organization.
So, John, both the Canusa and the concession BIA are in a pickle, if you will, in that both of these need to be approved so that the new base will be official with the increased amount moving forward in perpetuity. Mr. Deputy Mayor, through to John.
Through the chair, that is correct.
Okay, so Mr. Deputy Mayor, I don't know where this is going today. If this whole package is going to be, if there's a move on to defer the package, I don't know. But those two items definitely, you've had the explanation. I'm going to be fighting for those two items at some point in time. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor.
To you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I know and because grants is actually in my portfolio as well, I know that the recommendation to increase the base budgets were definitely referred to the budget process, but our last meeting did not happen because we didn't have quorum. So, John, you may be correct. I just want to make sure, because the Canusa item went to AFNA and then went to council independent because we couldn't wait. So I just want to make sure what was approved. Unfortunately, Angela's checking for me downstairs because I just want to double check the Canusa one. But the other ones are correct. Anything that's changing the base budget and the city enrichment fund does come through budget.
Yes, Paul.
Through the chair, and Stephanie is going to confirm it, but our understanding, the report that went was what is in the package today, and what was desired by the grant subcommittee was that the $10,000 difference would be part of the deliberations in the 2020 budget. So I think you're going to see it's the same piece at the end of the day. I do know it went for approval so we could get it moving through council, but it was essentially the same report that was at the grant subcommittee.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, the direction came through AFNA October 17th. It was motion 11.1 that referred it to the budget process.
Thank you. I can't check on this laptop. I left mine at home in the laundry room. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilor Marula, general question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just on the same line of questioning surrounding the deferral of the items until we bring down the budget, I think it's important that we take that approach, but I also want to emphasize through you, Mr. Chairman, that the animal services issue has no impact on the general levy. Hence, it's something that we can deal with outside of the approval process, since it has no general levy impact. So through you, Mr. Chairman, to Mike, can we just confirm that it has no general levy impact?
We can get to debate on that specific item, but General Manager, if you have a answer.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, my understanding is it would require a complement. So committee and council would have to approve. As I look at CR 13 there, while there's net levy impact of 0, if this were to be made a permanent program, it would require the approval of a full-time equivalent position.
Right, paid for through licensing revenue, so no general levy impact.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, yes. So you'll see on the table that's projected is, while it's gross 90,000, that the revenues would offset that. Again, what's required is the approval of a complement.
So this is an anomaly that I'd like to move today, and the fact that we're not only saving the lives of animals, but we're actually not impacting the general levy, and in partnership with all the rescues, we're doing a hell of a job compared to where we were in 2015. So at the appropriate time, I'm moving that this is approved today. Thank you.
Hold that thought, we'll get there. Councilor Ferguson.
Yes, I'm with Councillor Collins and Councillor Partridge and Councillor Marula. I'm not on for any enhancements while we're sitting at 3.5%, because we're going to have to do some cuts later. And I would certainly support an omnibus motion that we simply defer them all. Now, Councillor Marula can move an amendment at that time that there's no impact on the levy to defer them all. But that would be my first choice. And so if there's no support for that, I'd be happy to even move it.
So as of right now, the motion that I have in my roadmap is to approve. If you, we'll go through them each one by one, because there are some nuance there. And if we wish to change that, then we'll make a motion on each one.
So your roadmap says move each and every one of these enhancements? Approve them all?
My roadmap is to approve them all. If we,
Okay, I'll move then. We defer them to when? After the budget?
no, refer to a future budget GIC meeting. Madam Clerk?
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, since Ms. Emo is here to comment, I would suggest that we do hear her, and then if committee wishes to defer all of the items to a budget deliberation date, that'd be perfectly fine, but since she's made the time to attend, I would recommend that we hear.
I think I'll leave it up to Councillor Collins to make the motion, because I'm not clear what I'm supposed to do. I just know I don't want any enhancements while we're sitting at 3.5%.
If I may, we need a motion to receive the staff presentation.
So, apologize through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. Actually, I left the podium too early. I think I have one more slide on the previous presentation, so I'll get back to that one. But just as it relates to this 6.2, again, I appreciate we're in the hands of committee. There are staff available today, so if there are any questions with respect to these, staff are available to answer the questions, recognizing that there's a desire to defer this to future GIC, or we could bring staff back to a future GIC. So we are in the hands of committee.
So we'll receive the staff presentation. We'll hear the presentation from Ms. Emo. We'll receive that presentation. Then you can put the motion on the floor to defer this. If that passes, or Councillor Collins, if that passes, then debate is over. If it does not pass, then we can go through them one by one, questions of staff, and move each one individually. Is that okay? Okay, so motion to receive the staff presentation. Moved by, sorry, I didn't catch who moved. Moved by Councillor Partridge, seconded by Councillor Ferguson. All in favor? Carried. I'd now like to call on Marion Emo of the Hamilton Burlington SPCA to comment on the animal adoption pilot program. Please come on down.
Good morning, Deputy Chair. Have I got that right? Yeah, okay. Good morning, everybody. This is Chili Friday. Thank you for the invitation. I have not prepared a presentation. There have been a number of discussions over time with the city staff and particularly Ken Leenders. In recent discussion with the clerk's office and Ken Leenders, I asked how could I be helpful because the invitation was to join you. I'm prepared to make a couple of statements and answer any questions you have. And be of help in any way that I can be of help to you today. Fully recognizing, I would say on behalf of the Hamilton Burlington SPCA and our board of directors, you know, the aspiration to match homeless animals with new homes in the community, I don't think there's anybody in the community challenging that. So I just want to be clear. The second is, I know sometimes we are asked about what does it cost the Hamilton Burlington SPCA to run and manage an animal care and adoptions program. That's about $400,000 a year. That's inclusive of program oversight, intake, animal health checks, processing adoptions, follow-up, social media stories, volunteer and staff training, retraining, staff development, a whole host of things that are required, plus the administrative fees. That $400,000, which is approximate, and currently under review, we too are doing our annual budget, as you are as well. That does not include the, let's say, any costs related to the program's share of site infrastructure and the building. The only other thing that I would say that we think about, and I know that in conversations over the last 3 years, is what is the future of animal care and adoptions. There have been many discussions with my staff and Ken Leenders and his staff. So I think your team is fairly well acquainted with where the future is taking us. I would only say a couple of things where we have decided to go is there will always be animals that need rehoming. The case mix of those animals is changing. intake all over North America is changing. We are taking considerable time and effort to think about where do we put our resources. Our resources are as well going to closing the door at the front end. So how can we do better with our pet families, those in our communities who don't have access to veterinary services? So many of you who are familiar with our services would know that over the last several years, adoptions are going down, but in fact, in many of your communities, we're now doing 4,000 health checks and spay-neuters for people who don't have access to services. So we're looking upstream, closing the door upstream. The final thing I would say, we have not made the decision, as have many societies and rescue groups in Ontario and beyond, as intake goes down, as adoptions decrease, as the cost of adopting increases because the animals are changing, we have not made the decision as yet to import animals from across Ontario and elsewhere in Canada, as have many of my sister societies done, and which you may want to look at in the future. Why? We're very conscious of the research in terms of what those animals might be bringing into our communities. We're very sensitive to the rabies issue, and we applaud the work that the City of Hamilton and the teams are doing around rabies. So I'm just going to stop there just to give you a snapshot of where we're at. I don't know how I can be helpful to you this morning, but I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you. I do have a speakers list. Is this a point of order? Oh, okay. Thank you. Councilor Marula.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and many thanks for being here today, Marion. I really appreciate your time. So the good news is we've really come a long way since 2015 with respect to the kill rate in the city. To you, Mr. Chairman, as you can recall, we were known to be the worst in Canada. There was a great deal of angst in our community surrounding being the worst. The headlines read it. We took action on a motion I brought forward in 2015. There were 3 items: licensing of cats, the adoption issue, and the partnership with PetSmart. Since 2015, the kill rate, as you know, has drastically improved, so we're in the right direction. So I guess what we're asking is, do you endorse the fact that we're now have come this far and to continue down this path? And if not, why?
Thank you, through the Deputy Chair. Thank you for the question. I guess I would say 3 things. First, congratulations to the City of Hamilton for all the work that you've done. Kill rates, much as in Hamilton, are falling all over Ontario and the city, the country. The second thing that I would say is we've been very careful to say, you, the fathers of the city, you are going to make the decision about the adoption program. The reason that it would be difficult to say carry on and do adoptions is just as we would consult with any other group, any other rescue group, we would be asking these questions. How are you prepared for best practice adoptions? How are you thinking about the future when, generally speaking, adoption all over North America are going down for all the right reasons, closing the door at the front end? With respect to the own adoption program, the question we would put out to staff, again, not for us to answer, but for others to answer, in terms of the current setup, how long are adoptable animals continue to be kenneled until they can be adopted? 2, what does it mean for other responsibilities in the city? These are not answers I have, but does having an adoption program change, if at all, the relationship between the pound services as we have historically known? So I want to be careful but also clear. The Hamilton-Burlington SPCA doesn't see as its role to approve or endorse whether or not the city does adoptions. We do work with other groups who think we're getting into it. We have a set of guidelines that shape those discussions.
Okay, so then what I'm hearing is that you're glad that we've moved the yardstick so well, and you look forward to working with us, and you want to work on some of the details surrounding the relationship moving forward.
Absolutely, and I think what's important in that is how can we together take all the resources that are in the city and leverage those resources.
That's
For instance, as adoptions go down, and I can tell you, I don't know what the city's population is now, but pretty much across Ontario, it's very low. So in discussions that we've had with your staff, there's no question, particularly around cats and kittens, there are surge seasons. So what is the ideal response to the surge season? Is it another entity getting into the business of adoptions? It may be. Is it a group of us looking at a shared storefront? Is it a group of us looking at pop-up shelters when we need them? So there are options. Your team has been informed, and they have presented to you their
Through you,
approach.
Mr. Chairman, that's music to my ears. So you're looking at working collaboratively with everyone with respect to the rescue efforts, and not
We
trying to
work with
divide.
people locally, at the provincial level, and also at the national level.
All right, then. So I really look forward to working with you in the future, particularly on this adoption agency issue. We will, as I mentioned earlier, be bringing forward a motion to approve it today because it has no general levy impact. And truly, the invitation and you being here today means a great deal to me, and clarifying your position, because I think some of the comments made, or at least what was printed, misrepresented what you're saying here today, because it was a complete opposite type of scenario. So I really appreciate your time. But then again, I'm also not surprised either. So I'm glad that we heard it from the horse's mouth. Appreciate your time, Mr. Chairman, and thanks very much.
That's all right, it's
That was a
Friday.
compliment.
I'll take it that way. Thank you, Deputy Chair.
Councillor Wilson.
Thank you for being here. I know from discussing with some of my colleagues, there's many of us who are very passionate about the humane treatment of all creatures in our community and all communities, so thank you. I think if I cast my mind back to the original discussion we had on this staff report, there were questions that were asked of staff about, I think, two things. One was, how were other rescue agencies involved in the deliberations and consulted? And the second part was, what might be the impact on those rescue agencies in the overall environment of assisting in adoption levels? And it wasn't clear to me about how that consultation went, and it wasn't clear to me on the exact response of the SPCA in relation to the proposal. And I was wondering if you could to characterize how you were engaged, and two, your position on the proposal as it is before, as you understand it to be. Through you, Mr. Chairman.
Through the chair, yes, I can respond to that. So rescue groups were sent 4 questions, I believe 3 or 4 questions, that Hamilton Animal Services was looking for a response to. In terms of the Hamilton-Burlington SPCA, 2 of my staff met with Sue Russell, and I believe there was an accompanying staff with her. The staff found it very difficult in that short meeting to answer the question, do you think that a permanent adoption program at Hamilton Animal Services is a good idea? In part, because without some of the informations related to the questions I shared with your colleague, it would be hard. So they didn't feel that they could respond to that. On the other hand, we felt we should respond, if nothing else, to the impact. Again, being very careful that the Hamilton-Burlington SPCA does not see it as its role to say this is a good idea or not. That's for you. We did share comments on those questions with the lead staff person and with Ken Leenders in terms of the impact on the SPCA from a very factual, evidence-based point of view. So over the years, as per agreements that likely need to be refreshed, at the staff level, there was a relationship whereby we were, that several animals from Hamilton Animal Services were being transferred to the Hamilton Burlington SPCA. So if we looked at a continuum in terms of the city's role and responsibility rescuing animals from the community, and then moving them along to on the road to health and adoptions, that's characterized the relationship with the SPCA, and I think increasingly over several years with other rescue groups. So there has been a considerable reduction in the number of animals coming forward. That has meant a reduction in the animals that we take care of and adopt out. What that means is for us, and I know in previous discussions here, there's been the view that perhaps there's a little bit of a profit or a gold mine in adoptions. And I think in conversations, I hope the SPCA has dissuaded the city of that. So for instance, a healthy animal comes to us, it's adopted, didn't need much care. Great. What happens with every animal that's adopted, the portion of that adoption fee that has been used to either spay, neuter, do health checks or whatever, is transferred back into our hospital. And so what happens is adoption fees subsidize heavy care in our hospital. So overall, and we can provide you with those data, your team has those data, what it just means is we look to other sources to support heavy care. At the Hamilton-Burlington SPCA, we don't turn away animals for the care that they need. So you may have seen in recent media news the work that we do eye enucleations, we do limb surgery, heartworm, for instance, any animal that comes into our care, heartworm is an automatic 2-month stay in the shelter. What's important about case mix, and I'll stop there because I don't want to get too complicated. If you think about case mix of animals in care, it's no different than case mix in a physician's office. You have you have healthier patients and you have less healthier patients, and with that case mix, you're able to attend to all. No different than a rescue group or a shelter. So the impact on us is a change in the case mix, fewer, quote, I would say, healthier animals, and more high care animals. So the impact on us is really about how do we manage those high care animals? No animal is euthanized because it takes too much care.
Counselor?
Thank you. So if I could just go back to two things you've said generally so I understand them. In your response with respect to the consultation, did I hear you say then that maybe what was void or what made it difficult for your staff to answer those 4 questions is because in the opinion of the association, the questions sort of were unintentionally, but devoid of the context, the larger context of everything that is perhaps related to care of animals. So a context of overall adoption rates, the number of animals are going down for adoption, the issue of neutering and high care animals. Is that what you're suggesting? It made it difficult to answer questions about pure adoption in the absence of some of those larger care matters and who would do them and what would the implications be? I just want to make sure I'm understanding. Thank you.
Through the chair to you, I would say, yes, that's right. It's hard to answer questions on what do you think the idea of an permanent adoption program at Hamilton Animal Services is a good idea when you don't have the information in front of you as how has that gone in the past 18 months. That's part of it. So I think it was just difficult to offer an opinion without knowing what the previous 18 months looked like. That said, we were able to get back and answer the questions on impact by just by looking at the numbers.
Thank you. And on the second part of your answer, I think you've made clear that there are some animals that come into your care who are relatively healthy, and there are some who very regrettably are not healthy at all and require more intensive care, and with that, of course, comes cost. Were you intimating that the animals that would be staying in this proposal with the city would be the healthier animals, and the ones that are, because you have a hospital, for example, on site, I think, the higher cost animals would be necessarily be migrated out of the city's program and to those kind of rescue associations like yourself, who would therefore be required to carry those costs? Can I just get clarification on that, please, through you, Mr. Chair?
Through the chair to you, I would say yes, but that would be a question. I would not want to comment on whether that's the case because I don't actually know. I only know, I can't speak for what goes to other rescue groups in terms of case, and I can't speak to the animals behind, left being readied for adoption. What I can say is that fewer animals come to the Hamilton-Burlington SPCA. Certainly there have been requests, I'm not going to say we don't take any animals, there have been requests for us to take the higher care animals. And it's difficult sometimes to just take the higher care because the animals generally in the community that need to be homed, they're coming, people are living longer, they're keeping their pets longer, so by the time the pets arrive at a shelter, much like Hamilton Animal Services or ours, they may be older, they may be more frail. I can give you an example. I know it's difficult for Hamilton Animal Services, much as it is for many societies. When we go through a period of get lots of rabbits, rabbits take longer for surgery. Surgery is more delicate, so it takes more time. So if a rescue group was to experience that maybe rabbits come to them or we're being asked to do surgery for rabbits, great, although the case mix may be changing. So you may find a rescue group or like ourselves being asked to respond to heavier care animals without the balance of less care animals.
Thank you. So with the proposal that it is before you now, in your response to my colleagues' questions, I just need to clarify what the association's position is as in response to this proposal. Please, through you, Mr. Chair.
So through the chair, our response is, and I know that my board members have been very clear in public statements. We don't have an opinion as to whether there should be an adoption program or not. What we would say is, how will the city think about a permanent adoption program when intake all over Ontario, North America is going down? Will the city be open to tax dollars bringing in animals from other communities to help sustain the adoption program? And three, we would be looking forward to the city and all entities around how do we close the door, how do we allocate resources to close the door at the front end? How do we actually prevent intake into our kennels and shelters? What does that require of all of us in the city?
One more question. So part of that is the neutering? Is the front end?
There are a number of strategies. One is certainly spay-neutering, certainly working with families and neighborhoods about how to be the pet parent they want to be. People need help being a pet parent. How are we working in those communities where our data would show these are where animals are being removed and seized because of both intentional abuse of the animal, but more importantly, benign neglect. Hamilton, based on the number of hoarding cases that we see the last 2 years, and we measure that against what our sister societies are seeing in southern and southwestern Ontario, we have a huge hoarding issue in our community, which requires us to be working with mental health services, social services, and whatnot. Those are the barriers. So spay-neuter as much as possible, education as much as possible, and hoarding are the new frontier for animal welfare in our community.
So thank you very much. That's very helpful. So at the appropriate time, I'll be asking our staff what is going to be our strategy and approach to the broader issue of animal care. And this is one aspect of it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Councillor Clark?
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. So I have to admit I'm a little bit confused. Because when this first was brought up, there was a significant pushback from, I'm assuming, different folks at the SPCA proxies and different advocates for SPCA in the community, arguing that the city was competing against the SPCA on adoption. What I'm hearing today in very carefully diplomatic language is that it's not the SPCA's role to comment on whether the city should or should not create an adoption program. And at the same time, what I heard was that there would be an impact on the SPCA, that it would lower adoption fees, which would mean an increase in higher fundraising or trying to find revenue to offset those lower adoption fees aggregately, that the diversification of adoptions across a broader number, the city and the SPCA and other groups that are doing it, would mean that the animals that are very healthy and really good care would be more diversified and spread out, and that because you have an animal hospital attached to the SPCA, your share of animals having a higher acuity of care requirement on a ratio to the broader, healthier animals would increase, which again would impact your bottom line. So those are all things that I heard you say, and I'm trying to, you seem to be trying to be very diplomatic to the city, but I think you need to be candid. Is this going to impact the SPCA in the manner that I just said? And how does the SPCA, how are they going to address that? And secondly, is there a way that the SPCA and the city could work collaboratively to minimize that impact on the SPCA?
So through the chair to you, you're absolutely right. We clearly outlined the impact to staff, and it's not about a will happen, it is already happening. The second thing I would say is, so all of us would have champions in the community, so we have not done a campaign in the community. If people are saying this should happen or shouldn't happen, I can't speak for that. And on that note, I think as well, my chair at the time and currently my past chair has been very clear in the media around the city will decide based on the information in front of them. And so we were very clear to share that information with the city. I would say, absolutely, all of us, rescue groups, the SPCA, and the city are going to be challenged, if not already, with case mix. We are already going to be seeing higher care animals. The city is doing a fabulous job in licensing over the last 10 or 15 years. Dog owners are doing much better. There are fewer dogs coming into animal shelters and kennels. I haven't seen the recent data of the city, but I'm going to think that it would not be anomalous to others. But the dogs coming in are coming in for a reason, and so they're harder to adopt. And for instance, you never adopt out an animal that bites. On your last point is the SPCA continually open to working with the city on how best to leverage our resources? Our clinic right next door, absolutely. Up to 3 or 4 years ago, we were asked a couple of times, and I think your colleague Sam Marula was at those meetings. We submitted, they're outdated now, proposals to the city. How could we be helpful? How might you want to use our hospital right next door? We're very open to that. Just on the note of our hospital, it's an accredited hospital, and now, while we're not carrying the official word teaching unit, we are now a teaching site for the Ontario Veterinary College.
Okay, and I really appreciate that commentary. So I'm trying to understand then what was shared with staff with regards to it's going to lower the number, the aggregate amount of adoption fees. It's going to increase the acuity of care with your organization and what those impacts, were there financial numbers shared? I'm trying to understand exactly what was shared, because I don't recall seeing a breakdown in terms of what those impacts would be to the SPCA being presented to us in the presentation as to why this is a good thing for the city. And I'm trying to understand very clearly that we're not moving with haste to something that we all agree want to minimize euthanasia. That is going to dramatically negatively impact the SPCA in an unintentional manner.
Through the chair again to you, the SPCA did not share that information with members of committee or council. We did report to staff that overall, I'm not going to read it all out because that transfers to the SPCA have declined by 63% over 2017 and 2018. The question is often asked, well, you get transfers in from others. The transfers in from others have remained constant. So this in turn has decreased resources from adoption fees available to, as well, our TNR program, Trap Neuter Return Program, where we're spay-neutering street cats in your neighborhoods, keeping animals at home, and for some of the programs I've described. In that memo to staff, we talked about the case mix and what it means when you have higher case. With respect to, is your organization in favor of Hamilton Animal Services providing a permanent adoption program? We submitted that we continue to work with rescue groups, transfers for animals for spay-neuter in other cities. We could be doing some of your spay-neuter for you. I understand that you need to transfer to other vets and perhaps the OVC and incur those transportation costs. So we did suggest where there are opportunities to continue to work together. Would your organization continue to work with Animal Services in rehoming animals if there is a permanent adoption program? The answer is yes. I don't think we've probably had enough discussion about our role in that in the last 18 months, but we did say that the SPCA is open to hearing otherwise. We did say that the pilot adoption program, again, without having seen the numbers, that it duplicates service to community at likely a higher cost. I don't know your cost figures to providing those services. We can share ours.
Can you just, sorry to back up, Mr. Deputy Mayor, the 63% declination in adoptions? Is that what you indicated?
No, 63% in terms of transfers coming in from Hamilton Animal Services. I can provide you with what that means for adoptions, but again, I would say there's two issues. One, how many might come in? What role do we play with Hamilton Animal Services? But again, recognizing there are other reasons why adoptions are going down generally.
And so a reduction in the transfers would indicate to me your earlier comments about lower adoption fees because you no longer have the animals to adopt out, which lowers your revenue, and subsequently the change in your mix, you're having a higher acuity of care because you have the hospital. So that all ties together, and all of those numbers were shared with staff.
Some of those numbers were shared with staff, but we report regularly to our, certainly our board. We can share many more of those numbers if you like. I'm sorry I didn't say through the chair to you, or my apologies. And I will say that, you know, all of us are going to have to change up our business in the next few years, given the natural changes that are taking place in the environment. Our concern locally is, for instance, we are likely going to struggle with routing some of those adoption fees down the road to our colony caregiver program, because the SPCA is subsidizing the spay-neuter of our street cats 50% from our program revenues.
Thank you, and I appreciate you answering my questions, and I'm sorry to the committee for belaboring the time. As I indicated before, my desire is to just make sure that we're eliminating as much as possible unnecessary euthanasia of animals that could be placed into the broader community. and I don't want to see the city do something that unintentionally causes a problem for another organization. So I will have questions for staff. Thank you.
Counselor Jackson.
Thanks, Mr. Deputy Mayor. Thanks, Marion, for appearing here today. I'm going to pick up where Councillor Clark has left off because I'm a bit flabbergasted by what I'm detecting is a change of messaging. And before I get into a question to you, my comments, I've been a longtime supporter of the SPCA. I was honored to be there, Mr. Deputy Mayor, in 1996. With the former Lieutenant Governor, Romeo LeBlanc, and former Mayor Bob Morrow opening the beautiful site up on Dartnell Road. That's become, if you will, state-of-the-art SPCA facility, and now shared with our Hamilton Animal Services as well. A beautiful flagship building for other animal services to see and hopefully model after. And I was on the board for a number of years as well. So I come at this as a big supporter, Marion, of the SPCA. And I must say, Marion, sincerely, similar to Councillor Clark and even Councillor Marula, even though he was strongly for the Hamilton Animal Services side of the debate before Christmas, he and Councillor Clark and myself have detected a change. And I had volunteers from the SPCA, staff of the SPCA, contact me. The daily newspaper wrote an editorial in support of the SPCA versus any creeping in. Any creeping in.
You have the floor, Councillor Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. Any creep by local government creeping into a beautiful, wonderful, volunteer-driven organization with appropriate staff at the Hamilton Burlington SPCA. You and Doug Duke, your chairman, sent me a wonderful thank you email for my support before Christmas so that local government wasn't necessarily creeping into the adoptions and taking away potential revenue. And I'm hearing today that it doesn't matter to you what the city does. You don't endorse or you're not against this additional staff member that may increase the city's involvement with adoptions. Mr. Deputy Mayor, through you to the CAO, please.
Through the chair to you. So let me be clear. Is there an impact? Yes. As I've just reported from the information we sent to staff, do we think it duplicates services in the community? Yes.
Those are two yeses definitively. Carry on,
Yeah,
please.
and have been yes for some time. Third, I think our board leadership was out there clear in the community. They're not here today saying it's not our decision whether you have an adoption program. Do we think it duplicates service when there may be other ways to solve the surge season? Yes. Does it have an impact? Yes, it does. Am I going to stand here today and say you should have a program or not? That's not my role on behalf of my board. And I understand from your leadership that an adoption coordinator is essential to the adoption program. I can't agree or disagree. We have an adoption coordinator in our program as well.
If we were to today, Marion, Mr. Deputy Mayor, support Councillor Marula's motion to hire this additional FTA for Hamilton Animal Services, will you be messaging, please, to your staff and volunteers, some who were my constituents, who called me, begging me, imploring me to not support this, but to strongly support the adoption of the SPCA and not provide any impact by the municipality against you and your adoption and revenue, potentially. Would you somehow please message that to your staff and volunteers? Because I was supportive of the SPCA, and when I heard from my constituents, volunteer staff, I thought, you know what? This isn't the right thing for the city to get more involved with. And again, even the daily newspaper spoke on your side as well, very strongly, unequivocally. So, Marion, never telling you what to do with your job at all, but it's important to me to know after today's decision, if it is to get more involved by the city, for constituents and volunteers to call me in the future, Tom, I can't believe you supported that position. Well, Mrs. Williams, your CAO was here today, and she mentioned about, yes, impacts. However, it was our decision. It didn't matter to her which way we decided because it was our decision. Mr. Deputy Mayor, through you, and I'm trying to be very, very respectful, Marion, because I love what the SPCA does.
Through the chair to you. So I'm going to stand by our comments. It's your decision, it's not ours. And we're going to stand by our comments. Will there be an impact? Absolutely. Has there already been an impact? Absolutely. And again, the earlier questions that I posed in terms of a planning framework when your colleague, Councillor Marula, asked questions. In terms of how we direct our staff, whether it's this issue, whether it was the change in protection services at the government level that we're still trying to figure out the impact, our messaging internally to staff and volunteers is there are others in our community who have responsibilities to make decisions. We have a job to do, and we are going to continue to do that job. Under no circumstances, this council would have my personal guarantee. We don't lobby anti-city, we don't start up and lobby for anti-city campaigns. Will there be staff and volunteers who will still have strong feelings as to whether or not the city has an adoption program? Absolutely. No different than whether our staff and volunteers have issues with what the province is doing with protection services and whatnot. Our internal communication plan is we work with everybody who's our partner in animal services, and we continue to keep the door open for those who have made decisions that at an individual level people may not disagree with. What people say in their own home, in their own closed doors, that's their discussion. But that discussion around negativity in an open discussion with the public at the Hamilton-Burlington SPCA does not happen. One of our values is integrity and respect, and integrity and respect are important whether or not we agree with the decisions that our stakeholder colleagues take, whether at the local level, the provincial level, or the national level.
When your umbrella organization, Mr. Deputy Mayor, the Ontario SPCA, got out of the business, unfortunately, of cruelty charges to animals, I want you to know that Councillor Collins, Mayor Eisenberger, and myself at the Hamilton Police Service Board, we wanted to ensure that our Hamilton-Burlington SPCA would take a greater role in that, and now I believe specialized inspectors through the ministry are able to be hired by the SPCA, and just want you to know that our support, even through the Hamilton Police Services in consultation and in conjunction with you, was very strong at that table as well. Last question. Do you provide the same, it's always been Hamilton-Burlington SPCA for the longest time. Do you provide the same type of services to Burlington as you do Hamilton, Mr. Deputy Mayor, through you?
Through the chair, that's an excellent question. You will recall that up until many years ago, and I'm sorry I don't have that date right here, right now, it was the Hamilton SPCA since 1887. The reason it became the Hamilton-Burlington SPCA is because we were charged with the responsibility of responding to calls about animals in distress and animal cruelty in Burlington. So, given that that's not the case anymore, all inspectors will be hired by the province. They are not actually engaged by the local societies at the local level across Ontario. So one of the things that our board is looking at is we move through our next strategic plan, and consultation starts this month, and we look at branding. It's one of the things that we'll need to look at. What does it mean when we call ourselves the Hamilton-Burlington SPCA, when it grew out of the responsibility for animal cruelty in that community? That being said, do we provide the same services? Do people come into our shelter and adopt? Absolutely. We are just actually having discussion with some Burlington residents. In the same way we have our neighborhoods that we go into, many of your neighborhoods, that don't have good access to veterinary services and run $20 co-pay spay-neuters. We are being asked by the City of Burlington, we too have low-income residents in certain of neighborhoods. How can we work together so that you might be able to provide some service to those? So those are ongoing discussions.
So the same type of adoption service then is available at this time, Marion, to Burlington as Hamilton, through you, Deputy Mayor?
through the Deputy Mayor, the Burlington Humane Society, which is an independent standalone rescue group as well, and we work closely with them on a number of staff and volunteer development opportunities. They do take animals in there. I believe that they have also received animals from Hamilton Animal Services on occasion. They have an adoption program and they do adopt out animals. What they don't have in Burlington is a program, they don't have a clinic for spay-neuter, and they don't have a program that helps reduce the population of street cats in their municipality.
So I suspect maybe you may be entirely coming back home someday to the Hamilton SPCA, but that's for a future discussion. Marion, I appreciate the sincerity of all your answers. Please understand the advocacy that some of us were receiving before Christmas on your behalf, which led some of us to vote the way we did, not knowing that the messaging that you brought here today, but you have said two definitive answers of yes and yes, there still will be impacts. Thanks, Mr. Deputy Mayor.
Councillor Pearson?
Thank you, Mary. Thank you for all the information. Very appreciative. So my one question, because a number have been answered, is you mentioned way back at the beginning that adoptions are going down. Can you elaborate why that you're seeing this trend?
Through the Deputy Chair, yes, I'm happy to. I would say a couple of things. Ken will probably roll his eyes because I often say I'll say three things. First, I think locally we are making inroads with spay-neuter. That is particularly affecting the cat population. I would say the second thing is, as I mentioned earlier, for the most part, many people are doing better with pet ownership. So certainly in the last 10 or 15 years, dogs at risk and coming into kennel care is not only down at our shelter in Hamilton, but down across some rescue groups, and the data are very clear, down across Canada and North America. The other thing that I would say is, as we do a better job of supporting pet families with the help that they need because of their income levels, because of lack of awareness, sometimes when we are out working with those families, for instance, families who go to food banks need food for their animals, so we do that. A little bit of help in how to take care of your animal. The importance of being attached to a vet. The importance of us organizing our services so we can provide service to those who want to do well by their pet, but frankly can't afford it. And some of the discussions taking place at the national level are really about this. As adoptions go down, what does our future look like? Our future looks like continuing to support people so they take better care of their pets. You see those programs with the Hamilton Services and promoting licensing and whatnot. So that's what makes adoptions go down. The other reason adoptions will likely go down is it's sometimes harder to adopt the animals that come into care. So what's our forefront? We're seeing, for instance, in our care right now, we have an obese cat. Well, it's hard to adopt an obese cat. We need to get the weight down, and we need to train people how not to have obese pets. The other thing is more animals coming in with diabetes. Not every family is prepared to take on diabetes. More animals coming in that have not had the benefit of training and good ownership. They're anxious, they bite. These are harder animals to place. Then that might lead you to the question of, well, what does that mean for euthanasia? Everybody works very hard not to euthanize those animals. Our euthanasia rate is incredibly low, but our length of stay for animals is increasing. And this is a national phenomenon, that amongst shelters, having done really well in the last 5 to 10 years to get length of stay down, do right by our animals, in fact, we may have bottomed out. And we're going to see longer length of stay. But there's some good news in that, and interestingly, I was at work on the weekend, which I don't like to be, but sometimes I am, We used to get comments of people coming into the shelter and saying, oh my God, you got empty kennels. Why aren't you taking animals in? We always had to have a little space for when our protection agents went out in the community, had to bring an animal in. It's like a hospital. You can't say no to the crisis. Now we're hearing a little bit more from, oh, maybe this is a good sign. Part of that is a good sign. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Thank you very much.
Councillor Marula, are you going to drop a motion to license cats on the floor?
I guess I could do that again. It's a new term. It doesn't require 3/4. But, Mr. Chairman, I just want to wrap a couple of things up. So clearly, we're in a position where I think we're talking about how impacts on agencies matter when a decision is made. I want to work towards eliminating the need for the agencies, including the SPCA. Like, at the end of the day, the whole purpose of rescues and the whole purpose of adoption agencies is to work towards the elimination of the need so that animals are protected. Right now, more people are focusing in on trying to protect their own job than they are the animals, and I find that to be unacceptable. So let's work on collectively, as they do in Burlington. They have a humane society that does adoptions. You don't see them as a competitor because you work with them. So we now in Hamilton are going to have an adoption agency that is going to work with you, as they do in Burlington. Clear, equal playing field. I'm not sure why Burlington would be allowed to have an additional rescue and not Hamilton. Secondly, or thirdly, we need to really work collectively. I know through you, Mr. Chairman, that you're very selective in the animals you choose from our supply. So when you come and select your animals, you're very selective. Some of them need more maintenance than others. So you don't come in and just take what we give you. You only select what you need or want. So through you, Madam Chair, or Mr. Chairman, could you just elaborate on how you go about selecting animals from Hamilton Animal Services?
Through the chair to you, I'm probably not the best person to answer that question. I would want to have I think Hamilton Animal Service staff and our staff who work quite closely together on the ground when they can, they're probably best able to answer that. I think all rescue groups would understand that all animals deserve a chance. So this gets back to the case mix. Not so hard to look after, medium hard to look after, and high hard to look after. We are in a good position to take more of the higher care because we have a clinic on site. And we can respond on a turn of a dime when an animal needs intervention now. So we may be a little bit different from some of the rescue groups. Many of the rescue groups have relationships with vets. We have a standing team, high-class care team ready, sometimes at the turn of a dime, depending how many surgeries are scheduled in the hospital, Monday to Friday.
So, and trying to deduce this down to where it really, really belongs, in the last 18 months during the pilot, we saved hundreds of animals' lives. We've collectively worked with rescues, with yourselves. We have a plan in place that's been executed, and we're saving the lives of these animals. The rescuers are happy. People are on social media applauding our efforts. And just to give you some a little bit of a comparison, how ugly that message was back in 2015 when we were deemed to be the worst in Canada of killing animals and the nasty stuff we were subjected to. We've solved the problem, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure why we're having this discussion. I find it, to be quite frank, a little bit disconcerting and insulting. But having said that, we're going to move forward collectively, and I look forward to working with the SPCA. And I'm glad that you're revisioning the need for future of everyone that works for the SPCA. But more importantly, I'm glad that we're saving the lives of animals where the focus needs to be and should always be. And I will move that at the appropriate time, as I mentioned, and that would be seconded by Councillor Collins. But if not, Councillor Jackson. Thank you.
So Councillor Clark and Councillor Wilson on the speakers list. Was this question to the presenter? This question to staff? Councillor Wilson, question to the presenter? I'll come to Councillor Wilson and then we'll close the presentation and then questions to staff. So Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Chair Danko. I think it is appropriate for the presenter. Ms. Emo, I need to, for my own benefit, deduce this back to very first principles. So I understand your reference to implications, and not just implications for the SPCA, but more importantly for me, implications to the animals, because that is my first and foremost concern and focus. With the city's pilot, it shows that it has been successful in the adoption of X number of animals. And so my question is that success based on, were those animals that the city was successful in adopting, was it because the city stepped into a gap, or was it because the city stepped into a service area and in so doing didn't increase the overall number of animals that were being successfully adopted, but just shifted who they were being successfully adopted from? So rescue organizations would have adopted those animals, or the city's increased the number overall of adoptions. Do you understand? Okay, thank you.
Through the chair to you, I would offer up, without having seen all of the rescues adoptions, although there are people in the community who monitor that, I'm not sure that we saw more adoptions overall across all groups. But I don't have that information in front of us. When I think about generally intake overall going down, and when I think about some of the challenges those animals have when they come to us, without seeing the actual numbers for the whole city, it would strike me that we're probably adopting out about the same number of animals. But I haven't seen the numbers for the whole city. On your, is the city stepping in to provide a service? There's no question, and we've had this discussion openly with staff and Ken Leenders early on in the process. Are there surge seasons for especially cats and kittens where it feels like, oh my gosh, how can we move these cats along? Absolutely. The question I would ask of all of our stakeholders, is this the only solution to that? That's all I would say. So for instance, we have an adoption program, the city, I imagine, is continuing its pilot adoption program, and others. None of us have very many animals to adopt. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but there are seasonal fluctuations in animals available, not just in Hamilton, all over Ontario. So it sort of begs the question of communities, I think, and I know my colleagues and I are having those discussions. What do we do in that case? Because it becomes down to, and we're too struggling with that. For years, adoption has been a pillar of service to community. But that leg on the three-legged stool is going down for all the right reasons. So all of the legs on our three-legged stools over time will go down. So then the question for all of us is, when you have a permanent adoption program, what next? So I have colleagues, they are filling that program. Good for the community, good for staff, you keep staff employed. The last thing I'll say is we have this dilemma in health. So low birth weight babies in Hamilton, pretty high relative to other communities. What do? Do you build more neonatal intensive care units, or do you go upstream? Now the determination was we have to do both. But the single most important determinant for low birth weight babies is the mother's level of education. So that's why you see in our community, through the Community Foundation and others, going into schools to increase that. So I use that example, sounds extreme, but it's about over time and predicting the future. Once we have a permanent program, how quick are we prepared to change? Fully recognizing the gains the city has made on euthanasia. And how collectively do we anticipate and prepare for the future?
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair, I understand the hour. I don't want to belabor this, but it's really fundamentally important to me. So what I think I heard you say is you can't say because you haven't seen the numbers, but your sense is we haven't seen an overall across the city increase in the rate of adoptions. We've just perhaps seen a shift of where those adoptions are coming from. And secondly, your issue, which you're speaking my language on the low birth weight babies, is that casting our eyes forward as we're seeing a decrease in the number of animals been put up for adoption, the issue needs to extend itself, and the conversation around this table needs to extend itself, not just focusing on who's doing adoption. It's focusing on the upstream of what's our strategy for seasonal peak? What's our strategy for going into spatially defined problem areas, meaning animals that are intentionally being abused, animals that are being abused and neglected out of ignorance? What is our citywide strategy on that? What is our citywide strategy on neutering and spaying? It is all the upstream stuff. We seem to be focusing our energies on a problem of maybe shifting who's doing the adoption, but maybe not overall increasing adoption. And we're maybe not focusing enough attention on the upstream conversation and what are the roles and responsibilities of all stakeholders, including the city, in that conversation. Have I summarized that properly?
Through the chair to you, I would say yes. And if I can remember that summary well, I'm going to record it when I get back to the shop.
Thank you very much.
Councillor Pearson, is question for presenter, question for staff? Councillor Marula, question for presenter, question for staff? For staff, okay. So I'm going to have a motion to receive the presentation, moved by Councillor Pearson, seconded by, third time?
Put it in a conclusive type of scenario. So through you, Mr. Chairman, what's important is that we focus in on a couple of issues. First, the past, prior to the pilot project, the delivery model, we were seeing euthanizing of 6,000 animals a year due to lack of adoption. 6,000. And in 2016, the city sheltered over 3,400 domestic pets. SPCA only took 37% of that. 37%, it's only a third. Of the dogs and cats rescues, and 33% went to the other rescuers. So really, the reason why we're killing these animals is because there wasn't capacity for adoption. People weren't adopting, so you were taking the kittens, but you were leaving the 5-year-old the cat to get killed. That was the problem. We've now fixed that problem, and that's why we're moving forward aggressively. So at the end of the day, because I get emotional over this, because I can't believe we're having this discussion, the data clearly is spelled out. Do you want me to continue with the statistics? Do you want numbers? I have the numbers, but I don't want to embarrass you today, because you look at the stark difference between 2015 and the pilot project and today, we're talking a world of difference directly because of that adoption. You weren't doing your part. The rescuers weren't even doing their part. We are now doing our part, and we now have a complete job. Not to the level that it needs to be, but we're on the right track. And that's where we stand presently, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.
If I could comment on that through the chair. So I would say, first of all, you're not embarrassing me. Second of all, during the adoption pilot, we had room at the shelter. We could have taken more. So there's no question, if you want to go back, when our data go back 4 and 5 years, absolutely, was the shelter full? I would actually go back up to the last 18 months, and perhaps your staff and our staff and others, although I don't really want to focus on the past, look at what are the numbers coming in? Our numbers went down. They didn't go down because we chose not to take animals. I think we would all want to take a very circumspect look at the data, the timing of the data, the relationships that the city is developing with both rescue groups and the Hamilton Burlington SPCA, respectfully.
Councillor Marula, you've been on the speakers list 3 times. We've addressed this. Councilor Marula, you don't have the floor.
Challenge the chair if you don't want to do it. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, and I'm glad you've mentioned that. The bottom line is this. We are not killing the thousands of animals that we were killing prior to the adoption. Collectively working as a unit to try to eliminate the need for any type of agency such as yours or even our adoption agency. That's all people need to know. And guess what? It's being done without a penny on the general levy. That's something we need to be applauded for, not questioned. And I appreciate your time.
Last word, Ms. Emo.
I think, with all due respect, I hope, and I'll say it again, want to congratulate the city for the terrific work it's done on reducing its euthanasia rate. I would encourage the city to take a look at what's happening generally in the sector in the last few years. I think your staff also have some fabulous reports on trends in the sector and where we might want to consider allocating both our donor dollars and our tax dollars in the future.
Thank you for your time. Okay.
Thank you.
Motion to receive the presentation was moved by Councillor Pearson, seconded by Councillor Jackson. All in favor? Carry. Thank you. Questions for staff? And a reminder that this is the budget portion of the meeting. There's portions of this, the clerk is to remind me that are more appropriate for planning. But we can address some of the questions that were raised based on the presentation now. And then we do have a long agenda for the rest of the day. Councillor Clark.
So I wasn't here in the last 4 years, so forgive me if some of my questions are upsetting anyone around the table. That's not my intention. I'm simply trying to understand and ensure that we're not doing something that has an unintentional impact to an organization like the SPCA. And so when I'm looking at I think I heard it was an 18-month pilot. What were the adoption numbers like during that 18-month pilot? Because I'm hearing from our guests that the numbers have dropped dramatically.
Through the chair, our adoption during the 18 months, 760 animals were adopted by Animal Services.
760?
60 were adopted by Animal Services. The presenter was right. The number of animals that went to the SPCA had dropped dramatically. But I think it's important to note that we do not transfer animals. We ask all our supporting agencies to take animals. So some of the indicators of the adoption program, that the reason we say they were successful, it's not just the adoption of the animals, but the reputation of Animal Services across the province is increased dramatically to the point that we get more sponsors. We have increased our rescue partners from 35 to 55 during that period of time because people now respect what we do. We were also the only animal shelter that did not offer adoptions. And so now we are kind of full circle that we are actually offering adoptions. And I think the other thing is that we developed a fostering program from this. So, I mean, our ultimate goal is to get rid of animals and rehome them. We have about 3,000 animals to rehome every year. And that's why we rely heavily on all our rescue partners. Traditionally, the Hamilton-Burlington SPCA would take about 800 animals. Of course, in 2018, about 300 animals, and of course, in 2019, only 91. But that was not from us saying you can't have them. In 2018, we actually had to close a shelter 3 times because we were full. We couldn't take any more animals. And in 2019, we closed the shelter 6 times. So there is an abundance of animals. Right now, we have 42 cats. We have 23 dogs, and we have other 8 animals. So we have a lot of animals there that need to find homes, either through our rescue groups or our other partners, and of course, through our adoption program.
Thank you. And you've provided me with some helpful information. So you indicated that we were the only animal service, municipal animal service in the province of Ontario that didn't operate an adoption program?
Deputy Mayor, that is correct.
You indicated that you had to close the shelter.
Through the deputy
You
mayor,
had
yes.
too many animals, and so the adoption out wasn't happening as fast enough, and so you couldn't take more animals in. Is that the case?
Through the deputy mayor, that is correct. When we don't have enough room for any more animals, we actually close our doors.
And so how will this additional FTE prevent that from happening in the future?
Through the chair, the adoption program is not just about looking after adoptions and getting people to take care of these animals, but it's continue that relationship with our rescue partners. And as I said, from 35 to 55. We wouldn't need an adoption program if our partners took all our animals, but unfortunately they don't. As you heard from Councillor Marula, that the SPCA takes about 30% of our animals. If they took 100%, we wouldn't be at the table today. But we have to find any method we can to reduce euthanasia. And certainly from the direction of council, we wanted us to pilot this, and that's what the results are, that the adoptions is another part of that holistic circle of not only do we take animals in, but we try to rehome them so that we have reduced the euthanasia rate.
Thank you, but you indicated that you had to close the shelter twice in the last 2 years. So how would this, I think I have the floor.
Through the chair, in 2018, we closed the doors 3 times. In 2019, we actually closed the door 19 times.
So then how would this FTE help prevent that from happening? That was my question. I didn't hear an answer to that.
Well, and the bottom line is if we can move more animals, as we build our reputation and people realize that Hamilton Animal Services is in the adoption business, we will develop more partners or more people that will come and assist. We do have a lot of people that come now, and we've seen a steady increase. So as this program develops and matures, I think we'll be able to move more animals, and that's what that adoption FTE will be, to coordinate them, to take them to different pet stores, and having different adoption events, and that's the focus.
And our euthanasia rate has dropped dramatically. What's the euthanasia rate for 2019 and 2018?
Through the deputy mayor, our euthanasia rate for dogs and cats in 2019 is 15%. And in 2018 is 18%. So that's a combination of cats and dogs. Included in that euthanasia rate is also owner requests. So when people come and don't have a veterinarian and they ask us to put down their animal, if they're non-adoptable, we do.
And the animal service, we don't operate a hospital. SPCA operates the hospital.
Through the chair, the SPCA has an animal hospital. We actually use vet services and the University of Guelph to assist us in some of our care.
And so you heard what was said here today, that in essence, the transfers have dropped by 63%. So the impact to the SPCA is a loss of adoption fees and higher acuity of care on the animals, and they have to find other revenue to offset the loss of those fees. So they said that they shared all of that information with you. How do we address those issues? We just say that's up to them?
Through the chair, we're not reducing the number of animals that they can take. We still have a lot of animals. And so I can't force the SPCA to take any of our animals. So they come over and they select animals as they want. The reduction has been attributed to them not coming over. And in 2019, where they only took 91 animals, where traditionally they have taken on average about 800. So
when they say there was a 63% declination or decline in transfers, our response is that they didn't come over to take the animals?
Through the deputy mayor, that is correct.
Fascinating. Appreciate your information. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Councillor. So back to the council-referred items. I heard earlier there's desire to refer all of these to a future GIC meeting. Councillor Collins was going to put that on the floor. If that is done now, there will be no further discussion on this. We do have staff here. So it's up to you, Councillor Collins, to move that now or alternative would be to open these up for discussion. There is also, Councilor Marula, I believe, desire to approve CR 13. So if the blanket referral is moved, then that CR 13 will go with that. So I'll leave that up to you, Councilor Collins, if you would like to put your motion on the floor. Anybody going to put that on the floor? Councilor Wilson?
Thank you. I did commit earlier to ask a question of staff about the larger upstream conversation, and I'd like to follow through on that through you, Mr. Chair, to Ken. About the context, if we're stepping into the adoption, I don't want to use the word business, but if we're stepping into this permanently, what other steps are we taking to address some of the issues that Ms. Emo identified related to the well-being and care of animals? Specific reference was made to spaying and neutering. Specific reference was made to the spatial expression of animal abuse and neglect, and special reference was made to both education and the relationship between hoarding and abuse. Thank you.
Through the chair, I think it's important to know that we do have a very good working relationship with the Hamilton Burlington SPCA. In particular, about 2 years ago, we formed a community cat coalition where we're discussing issues about cat and cat population, overpopulation, and in particular feral cats and how we manage them. And so that work continues. So that is certainly one of the areas we're focusing in on. In relation to abuse and all that, as you know, the provincial government with the OPP have taken on the work of abused animals and cruelty cases. However, we are noticing there's been an effect on animal services in relation to having to hold animals in trust for investigations. In relation to dealing with adoptions, all animals that leave our facility are spayed neutered. Every animal that comes into our care receives a rabies shot. And we also do significant care with them and all. So we are part of that equation. We are part of the solution, as Marian had said from the SPCA.
Just on that last point, animals that come into the care of the city, animal services receive, if needed, spay and neutering. Is that what you just said? And secondly, does part of our care extend to having a strategy for being proactive and going out into maybe areas of our community that we know from our data are more susceptible to not spaying and neutering?
Through the chair, all animals that are through our adoption program are spayed neutered. And then, of course, as I've said before, we went from 35 to 55 partners as far as rescues. And when we work with the rescues, the animals that rescues get are traditionally have some kind of vet care or rabies shots or other shelter shots. As far as going into the community and education, no, we don't. Our mandate has been in responding to animal calls. And as you know, we respond to about 20,000 calls for animal calls throughout the city, and probably about 40% of them are actually wildlife calls that actually are a concern for our citizens, but are the mandate of the Ministry of Natural Resources.
Finally, one last question. I'm just curious, why do we use vet services and not the animal care hospital services provided by the SPCA?
Through the Deputy Mayor, that's a great question. The quote that we received from the Hamilton Burlington SPCA is much higher than the current money that we would spend at our contracted vet services. We also get free vet services from the University of Guelph. So understanding that the taxpayer is going to pay it in the long run, we go with the cheaper service.
Thank you very much.
Councillor Collins?
I would move the blanket deferral.
I'll second that.
So deferral of all the council-referred items moved by Councillor Collins, seconded by Councillor Partridge. On the floor, Councillor Clark.
So just on I support the deferral, but just on the direction on CR 03, which is the 10-year fire service delivery plan, if I could ask the fire chief to be prepared, so I can't even talk this morning, long HCA meeting. I know we're doing this tiered response review. I'm trying to understand, we're proposing 14 FTEs here as the first phase of the 10-year plan, yet we don't have the response report back on the potential changes that the tiered response review might implicate on HR. So and we don't need to have that response today, but before we have to deal with it as a budget item. And the second item, I've been crunching a bunch of numbers because I have the Isaac Brock station, we have a hybrid station, we have part-timers and full-timers, and so then I've been looking at all of the part-time stations across the city, and we have a challenge with, we don't have the complements of part-timers. There's a collective agreement on how many part-timers we should have in each of these rural stations, and in some of them we're down dramatically from where we should be. I'd like some type of response back in terms of how we're addressing that, because I'm nervous that we're going to be replacing part-timers who are very efficient and do the job very well, and migrating to full-timers at a much larger cost. And I'd like to make sure that we've got the full complements as approved already to our part-timers across the city, and I know we don't. We're down dramatically. So I'd like to have those numbers and how we're addressing that issue in terms of HR recruitment and things like that, to ensure, like, if I'm out in Rockton folks may not even know we have volunteer firefighters because they're new folks that have moved out there. How do we promote it out there so that people that are living close to the station know that they can be part-time firefighters? Those would be the two directions. Is that a motion, Mr. Deputy Mayor? Direction back?
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, it's clearly up to the councillor. If they're coming back to the meeting on the 13th, I don't think the motion would be approved prior, so you could do it as direction, but if you want it as a motion, I would certainly do it.
I'm looking to the chief. Is that time frame, Mr. Johnson and Chief, suitable, or do we need to?
Deputy Mayor, we will have answers for that, so helpful for us to know in advance, and we'll be able to clarify that.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So those are just the two issues. If we can include those, Councillor Collins, I'm very pleased. Thank you, sir.
Okay, so we have the motion to refer to future budget GIC meeting. We'll wrap up this vote, and then General Manager Zagarek has some additional information on one of his slides that was missed. We'll go back to him after we vote on this. So all in favor of referring to a future budget GIC meeting, the council referred items? Moved by Councillor Collins, seconded by Councillor Partridge. Carry. This is electronic vote in my roadmap.
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, it was electronic vote if you were going to approve it, to move and second it to approve it, but you're deferring it, you're keeping it here, so you're not doing anything with it. There's no vote.
Okay, thank you. So before we move on to 6.3, we have some additional information from.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I apologize. I moved off of 6.1 too early. There was one additional slide in 6.1, which was the Hamilton Entertainment Facilities. And Brian is just loading that up, and I'll just take you through that slide. we go. Thank you. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Stephanie. So what I wanted to, through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I just want to take a minute to highlight how Hamilton Entertainment Facilities is reflected in the preliminary budget and propose some amendments. You'll see that as it relates to some of the what is reflected in the budget book is the amendments per the agreements, and the 589,000 you'll see as it relates to the total impact is principally comprised of a $350,000 change as it relates to profit sharing. So what was reflected in the budget book was an expenditure as to the relationship with Global Spectrum of $350,000. What wasn't reflected in the budget book, I'm suggesting, is the profit sharing to offset that. So there may be a further amendment of $350,000 to reflect profit sharing as it relates to Global Spectrum. The other factor that is incorporated into that 500, just short of $590 or $590,000 impact is a one-time payment to Carmen's Group of $100,000. And similar to our discussion around dividends, we don't budget for one time into the operating budget in perpetuity. And so what I'm suggesting is that we, one option is to amend the $590,000 by reducing it by $450,000, reflecting some offsetting profit sharing of $350,000, and to amend for a one-time commitment of $100,000. So again, that is before committee for your consideration, and that would reduce the $590,000 again by $450,000. So somewhere in the area of bringing it down to about $140,000. And through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I apologize. This was the last slide. And again, we're in the hands of committee as it relates to those proposed amendments. And if it's the will of committee, we would reflect it as amending the budget for Hamilton Entertainment Facilities to $140,000.
So we've already accepted and approved 6.1. This would be, Madam Clerk, in addition to that?
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, 6.1, I thought we just received. Just bear with me for a moment because we've been moving. Just do it separately. We can just do it separately under motions, and that will clear it up. Thank you, Councillor Collins.
So we'll continue with the agenda, and then Councillor Collins, please remind me when we get to motions to bring this back. Okay, 6.3.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, and just as Brian loads up the 6.3, which is the business cases, you'll see, and I'll speak to it, and Brian can pull up the presentation. You'll see that there are 9 business cases, while the table speaks to 10 in detail. The business cases also reflects the discussion around the Animal Services Committee just had. So again, there was a timing issue where the business cases were developed prior to the motion at planning to refer this to the budget process. So again, just 9 business cases. If all 9 business cases were to be approved, it would represent a 2020 net levy impact of about $1.2 million and would require approximately 27 FTEs. You'll see that in a few cases, there is some potential efficiencies or reductions, but requiring full-time equivalent positions, so some complement, as well as a few business cases where there is no net levy impact, but again, requiring some complement. So again, similar to the council referred items, staff are available today to walk through the business cases, and we're in the hands of committee as to how committee may want to proceed as it relates to the various business cases. But again, staff are available to answer any questions or to describe each of the business cases.
So similar to our previous discussion, in the roadmap, the motion is to approve the 2020 business cases. There are 3 choices for committee. We can proceed with that as a blanket approval. We can receive each one, or we can refer to a future budget GIC meeting for this year's budget or the 2021 budget. We could also do a blanket referral at the end and have discussion on each one of these items individually. So I will open up the floor with the intention is that we'll have discussion on each item individually. And we'll start with Councillor Clark.
Thank you. So instead of going through them chronologically, if I can just jump to BC 05. And if the Chief of EMS could just step forward very quickly. So we're basically adding an ambulance, from my understanding. 10 FTEs is specifically to add that ambulance, which is required in our ongoing battle with Code Zeros. I'm trying to understand where we are with the land ambulance agreement for, where are we now? We're in 2020. So back to 2018, we would have received money in 2019 for 2018. Do we know that it's supposed to be 50-50? I'm trying to understand how much of the $1 million do we get back from the province, and where are we in terms of how close to the 50-50 agreement, a signed agreement I might add, with the province are we when we're getting the money back from the province? Because we spend it out first, correct, Mr. Deputy Mayor, through the Chief? We have to spend the money and then we apply to get the money back.
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, great question, Councillor. The 50-50 funding formula in the first year of implementation is always a confusing one. I get confused by it sometimes, and I'm sure the ministry folks do as well. The practice that the ministry has put into place of the $1 million for application in this year, we would see that funded in the 2021 fiscal year in normal processes. Normally, the Ministry of Health does not fund it in the first year of operation. So we always have a 1-year lag, which means technically that of a $1 million increase, council-approved increase, you would be picking up the cost on the tax levy on the first year of 100%, on the second year, normally 50%. That all presumes the ministry consultation process and cost funding arrangements and sharing do not change as a result of government, other provincial changes.
So is it possible, Mr. Deputy Mayor, because I'd be very keenly interested in seeing the last 5 years of that 50-50 agreement. Because I'm seeing, for example, in Niagara and Ottawa and other municipalities, they're not hitting the 50-50. They're, you know, the municipality is paying 52, 53%, and the province is paying, you know, 47, 48%. I know it's, you know, 1, 2, 3%, but when you're talking millions of dollars, it's a lot of money. And so I'd like to understand where we are with the compliance of that agreement with the province. Is that possible to get those numbers?
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, yes, we can provide those numbers for the last 5 years. I would just caution that when you're looking at the numbers, when we allocate in a current year format 50-50 questions, we would have to discount to come to that equivalent, the 50% in year 1. Clearly, we would not be receiving 50% every year. We've had funding enhancements and staffing enhancements each year over the last several years, so those would not have been funded in year 1. So we'd have to understand that as we're analyzing the information, but we can provide that information to your councillor.
Even if you can just provide a notation to that as a reminder, but I think I'll remember that. But the next question would be to Mr. Deputy Mayor, to Mr. Zagarek. So how do we account for this on a financial level if we don't receive the funding until the following year, but we have to pay out the $1 million for that unit, which is capital as well as the operation for that 1 year? Is $1 million, that's everything included, correct?
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, the $1 million is the current year cost of moving forward.
Yep.
It is approximately, you'll see in the notes, about $1.3 million for a full 12-month fiscal operation. That is exclusive of the capital for the vehicle. We've already talked about the capital process, so the capital is set separately. But the $1.3 million does include the recapitalization cost for vehicles into future years.
Thank you. And dispatch is still province-wide, so it doesn't get in our budget at all?
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, that's correct.
So, Mr. Zagaric, if you could just help me understand the finances.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, as Chief Sanderson identified, is the additional vehicle was reflected in our 2020 capital budget. It is 90% funded, I believe, from development charges, leaving about $25,000 for existing residents to cover. As it relates to the lag, I'll describe it as a lag, as it relates to the first year of implementation of an enhancement. In realizing the provincial cost sharing in the past, we've leveraged reserves to cover off a portion of that lag, so we don't increase the operating budget just to reduce it the following year. So in the past, we've used reserves to cover for that, and as Chief Sanderson's identified, is what we're seeing is some change in methodology across the province. At the Treasurers Group, we're seeing different experiences as it relates to the change in funding across municipalities, and it would appear that based on our comparisons as to our experiences, those municipalities that are realizing greater growth are seeing a higher proportion of the funding from the province of Ontario as it relates to the cost sharing for paramedic services. So it's something that we need to be very mindful of is the assumption around the 50-50. It may no longer be assumption over 50-50. It may be migrating to a 46% provincial, 54% municipal, but something that we need to monitor going forward.
And I think that's why a 5-year background would be very helpful, because I'm not sure how much consultation is occurring, but I have been made aware from other municipalities that the changes are occurring, and it's resulting in significant impacts to the local municipalities. So I'd just like to keep an eye on that if we can. So if we can have that when this document comes back to us, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Councillor Jackson.
Thanks, Mr. Deputy Mayor. Once you achieve quorum, I'm going to move a deferral on 6.3 as well. So until we achieve quorum, though, I have a couple of questions. Mike, General Manager, so between 6.2, which are about 13 items, and the 5 items here on 6.3, between these 18 items, General Managers, my simple arithmetic saying if every single item was approved, 5 plus 1 is over a $6 million budget pressure we'd be dealing with and adding on to the levy, Mr. Deputy Mayor, through you.
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, that's correct. About a $6.2 million impact. It would represent, again, about a 0.6% residential impact. I should note that with the 2 amendments that committee just approved this morning, which was the Huck dividend and the amendments to Hamilton Entertainment Precinct, I would expect our current position of 3.5% to drop to about 3.4%.
Terrific, Mike, thank you. So, and Mike, once again, just for public consumption, 6.2 was council referred. Basically, they fall into the enhancement category. 6.3, business case. It almost sounds like the 6.3 business case are professionally staffed SLT recommended, whereas the council referred enhancements are politically motivated on behalf of community, et cetera. Mike, just for public consumption, can you clarify the two, please? Because for me, both are potentially going to be debated and adding pressure to the overall levy if approved. Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, please. Just on the language, Mike.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I would suggest how the councillors described it as a good description. Is the council referred are items that arose in year or previous years that were referred to the budget process. As it relates to business cases, these are opportunities that departments have identified and are bringing forward. It may be opportunities to align to the strategic plan. It may be opportunities as it relates to in-year discussions, and then there may be opportunities that could positively affect the levy position and help to achieve council's guidelines. So again, it's a mix of opportunities as it relates to business cases, but as the councillors described, they are opportunities that senior leadership team are putting forward to committee for your consideration.
Thank you, General Manager. So again, Mr. Deputy Mayor, we've deferred 6.2 at the appropriate time. Once the questioners on your list are exhausted, I'd like to move the same. And I'll just basically say why, Mr. Deputy Mayor. Although we may have had these previously, we've already been about 3-4 months into the budget session. Memory lapses could occur, especially I'll start with mine. And these two, there's 23 items on here, all very important items, but we also know we're balancing that against the fiscal reality of what our taxpayers could potentially absorb and support. And so I just need more time to huddle and to refresh myself and delve into them more and more. Thanks, Mr. Deputy Mayor.
I'll come back to you for that motion. Councillor Ferguson.
Yeah, just to understand the report, Mike, where you see gross and net is blank, does that mean there's no cost to the levy when it's blank?
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, that's correct. It could be funded from reserves. There are some of the options that are funded from reserves or fees. And again, where it shows a dash or no value under net, there's no net levy impact. However, the principal reason why it's before you is staff require council's approval for complement. So while some of the options have no net levy impact, they require complement staffing.
So the only two that, looks like there's only two that impact the levy. One is the additional land ambulance and the other is the graffiti.
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, that's correct. And under BC-06, actually, there's a potential reduction to the levy of about $90,000, but again, requires complement.
Okay. Just a question on that. When you're switching from consultant to permanent, is it not lower cost when they become permanent because you're not paying the fees of the consultant that's supplying these individuals? You're showing there's no savings, I think.
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. Yeah, in this case for Public Works, it's inspection services. So absolutely, if we need inspectors from the consulting community, they cost us a lot more per hour than it would if we used our own staff. And in this particular case, we would engage the use of students as well to cut the costs even further. So.
Okay, that's great, Dan. Thank you. And so I just want to be clear on BC-04. I know I was intimately involved in this. Pardon me, got the wrong one. BC-09. This is the issue around WSIB where there's a change to the Income Tax Act for someone who's on off work due to injury. WSIB is not taxable. So the net result is that people who were off work, primarily police, were making more than the officers that were working full-time. And so Barb Howe was able to get her hand around it. Mike, do you know what the net savings was by making that change and implementing it in police and fire?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, and I did mention this during the Corporate Services Departmental presentation, and thank you to the councillor for recognizing Barb, who's had a lot of involvement in this since 2017. In 2019, so on a per case basis, it's about $40,000 per case. In 2019, we tracked, it's principally police because fire, I believe, was implemented partway through the year. The impact in 2019 was $1.8 million in savings.
And so that $1.8 million was already taken off the police budget?
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I would assume so. I don't have that level of detail as it relates to Hamilton Police Services, but I would assume that it's reflected in their current position.
Okay, I would like, Mr. Chairman, to get that confirmed, because $1.8 million is a lot of money. And you know, police are asking for over 4% increase, and if they got the savings because of some changes the city made in how they did the payroll, they've really gone up a lot more than 4%. And so if you could just confirm in a future meeting, because it sounds like Councillor Jackson is going to defer this, is that we find out where did that savings go? And maybe members of the Hamilton Police Services budget know that, did you take this $1.8 million off your cost for 2020 because of this payroll savings?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, we can work with Hamilton Police Services, and I'm not sure if we have information with fire, and we can try to track that as well. I just want to caution that it may not result in a budget decrease because of offsetting pressures in WSIB. So again, what we'll ask is whether or not it might have mitigated some of the pressures as it relates to WSIB. So you may not see clearly you may not see an offsetting reduction. But the 1.8, to be clear, was not just related to Hamilton Police Services. There were some savings in fire services.
Would it be 85% police?
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, Barbara's advising me it's, that would be reasonable, yeah.
Okay. Because I don't hold the chief and the board feet to the fire that if we did something that generated significant savings to you, there should be a offsetting budget reduction coming from them. And although I see our two police reps aren't listening. Rather than kick the whole thing down, kick the can down the road, do a Ellie Mae Clampett and kick the can down the road, is it not reasonable if there's no cost impact to us that we just approve the extra staff? I mean, that one's clearly worth it, the payroll enhancements for WSIB, when you're getting $1.8 million in savings. And the others, there's savings too. You just heard the General Manager of Public Works say it's actually cheaper to do it in-house than it is to bring in outside consultants. So is it necessary to kick those down the road when there's zero impact to the levy?
It's up to committee to decide. Right now, there's indication to have a blanket referral. If committee changes their mind, then...
The thing is, we have to start whittling away at this thing. And
if you wish to go down that road, we can go through them one by one, but right now, there's a desire for a blanket referral.
Okay, I'll vote accordingly then when I hear that. Thank you.
Councillor Clark?
I'm still trying to figure out the reference for Ellie Mae can't clamp it. I'll just let that go.
I missed that.
BC01, Mr. Deputy Mayor. So in my preamble to the question, remember that we agreed to this efficiency audit by the province of Ontario. They coughed up some money, and one of the things they said is that if you go from consultants to bring in-house the work, you're going to save money. So I'm trying to understand that when I'm looking at real estate, converting contract positions to permanent, you're going from 323,000, I don't see any savings in the net side. So where do we capture the savings by being more efficient by bringing them in-house?
Yeah, so through the chair, so these aren't external consultants. So in the real estate group, with increasing numbers of transactions, that real estate group is a fee-funded group. They're funded by fees off of the real estate transactions that they negotiate and assist with. So in response to increasing levels, we hired contract staff, 3 contract staff, about 2 years ago. Our approach typically is to, if we're seeing higher volumes like that, to first hire on contract to see if the volumes sustain themselves, and we can maintain them just as in-house contract staff for 2 years. But to make them permanent, we have to come back to council for approval. So these are existing internal staff who are on contract. They are funded off the fees they generate through their transactions. And the recommendation before you is to make those contract staff permanent staff, continuing to fund them off the same fees that are funding them today.
And so then the logical question for me would be, looking to the future, we're going to see a need to maintain these 3 positions in real estate, because the work in real estate is not generally I mean, it goes up and down.
Yeah, so through the chair to the council, that's the very reason why we initially start with contract staff. We didn't come 2 years ago to make them permanent right out of the gates. We want to make sure that those activity levels do sustain themselves. They have. We are experiencing year-over-year growth in terms of the number and value of the real estate transactions that are being negotiated through that section. So this increase in complement, as I said, would make contract positions permanent, continue to be funded off of those fees. If volumes, so the current level of activity would sustain that. If volumes continue even more in the future, I would suggest we would probably take the same approach. We wouldn't come first for an FTE. If necessary, we would take additional staff on contract, give it a couple of years and see if it sustains itself, and then come in front of council for the FTE. We just can't extend the contracts beyond a 2-year period. We have to either terminate them or make them as permanent positions.
Thank you, and I agree to the deferral of all the items, not because we can't make some of the decisions here, but in terms of making it nice and clean for the clerk and for us as we go forward with the budget process. It's nice to just keep them all lined up and we deal with them accordingly. If we start to pair them out individually, it becomes very problematic in terms of trying to put it all back together when we come back in for a budget report. So I'm fine with the deferral until a future meeting.
Thank you. So I don't believe that we received the presentation. So I'll need a motion to receive the staff presentation. Moved by Councillor Wilson, seconded by Councillor Pearson. All in favor? Carry. And then a motion to refer the 2020 business cases to a future budget GIC. I believe moved by Councillor Jackson, seconded by Councillor Pearson. All in favor? Carried. So, moving on, thank you everyone, to item 7.1, which is an information report on living wage school crossing guards citywide.
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, my apologies just because it's been moving. So does that mean the HEC-FI matter? You're going to wait till the end. Okay, I just want.
Any discussion on 7.1? Seeing none. Moved by Councillor Partridge, seconded by, anybody? Councillor Nan, all in favor? Carried. Item 7.2, living wage report. Is there any discussion on item 7.2? Councillor Nan.
Thank you, through the Deputy Mayor. Just a question on, from my understanding of Appendix A, page 1. Is it, if staff could just help clarify what I think I see in front of us here, is that the salary grades indicated between 1BK down to 1AK, and then moving it over to the amended wage rates at a living wage rate. In the hourly rate, step 1, why can those two not begin at 16.45?
Anybody?
So through the Deputy Mayor, I apologize, I'm not sure we understand the question.
On Appendix A, which is a useful chart, existing wage rate versus amended wage rates applying the living wage rate of 16.45. For the salary grade rates 1BK and 1AK, both of those hourly rates at step 1 are the only two that are currently under the living wage rate. So in the chart on the other side, I'm just curious why step 1 wouldn't begin at 16.45 instead of 17.56 and 19.36. Am I?
So through the Deputy Mayor, the rates on the, for the living wage, there, that's the last, 1AK, 1K, and 2K, those are to maintain internal pay equity. And that's the differential between that rate and the ones above.
Okay, that's what I assumed.
Get adjusted accordingly.
but I wanted to make sure that that was what I understood. Thank you. That's it. That's all the questions I have on this report.
Okay, so seeing no further speakers, I need a motion to receive item 7.2, moved by Counselor Nan, seconded by Counselor Collins. All in favor? Carried. Thank you. On motions, Counselor Collins.
I would move then the figures that Mike, if he wants to refresh us on that for the purposes of the clerk writing this into the motion, I would move the reductions that were presented on that last slide in 6.1.
Is that clear enough for you, Madam Clerk?
Mr. Deputy Mayor, yes, Mike and I will make sure I have the correct wording.
Moved by Counselor Collins, seconded by Counselor Ferguson. All in favor, electronic vote. Thank you. And just a reminder before we adjourn, we have a follow-up special GIC followed by a council meeting after this. We have minimum quorum right now, so please stick around. So motion to adjourn.
No, I need about 10 minutes, and yes, we can start immediately following. Unfortunately, the agenda went out immediately following, the calendar shows immediately following, but there is a glitch between eScribe and the web where it still shows as 2:30 on one of them, so they are working at fixing that. But your actual documents and anybody that has called in has been advised. 10 minutes.
So motion to adjourn. Moved by Councilor Pearson, seconded by Councilor Ferguson. All in favor? Carried. So 10 minutes, and we'll be back for.